He was a high-profile millionaire making waves in Atlanta.
He loved to be about town. He fancied himself as kind of a great Gatsby.
She was an exotic island beauty in search of the American dream.
She was ambitious, she was intelligent, and she was trying to better herself.
When their stars collide, their steamy romance plays out like an X-rated movie.
Sexually, they were like fireworks. He told people that she satisfied him in a way that no one else satisfied him.
But just when their carnal lust reaches its peak, an intimate secret is exposed.
For him to have such a secret life, that was a shock.
And the consequences are deadly.
When someone is beaten, that really blood splatters everywhere.
Investigators soon uncover a bevy of beautiful suspects, each with their own lurid connection to the victim.
He really led a secret life. Sometimes that would include threesomes, foursomes.
There were lots of people who had motive. There were lots of people who had opportunity.
This was one of the most gruesome scenes that I had seen. The question is, who was angry enough to have done this?
August 8th, 1996. It's a serene morning in the upscale Atlanta suburb of Roswell, Georgia. But that tranquility is shattered when police receive a desperate 911 call. On the line is Jackie Herndon.
Emergency, somebody done killed my baby. Okay, tell me what's going on. I don't know, I came in the house, he's 40 years old, I found him in the bed. Hurry, please.
Police rush to the address and race upstairs to the master bedroom.
Police department.
What they find is unsettling to even the most seasoned officers.
Room is unbelievably bloody. The sheets are covered in blood. The pillowcases are covered with blood. It is a very terrible scene.
In the bed is the naked, lifeless body of a middle-aged African-American male.
Major crimes and forensics.
His head was battered in a very forceful way, no less than 14 times.
The victim is identified as Jackie's son, 41-year-old Lance Herndon, a successful and highly regarded businessman in the Atlanta community.
Lance was a high roller. He had a beautiful home in Roswell. He had nice vehicles. He dressed well. He took care of himself.
He's been down about 12 hours.
As medics pronounce Lance dead, police begin to process the scene. But what nobody inside this upscale Atlanta home can fathom are the twisted skeletons lurking inside the closet of one of the city's rising stars.
I've described Lance as somewhat of an iceberg. I mean, what you saw was what was sticking out of the surface, but below there was a lot of other stuff going on.
Born in 1955, Lance Herndon grew up in the historic New York neighborhood of Harlem. With both of his parents working full-time, Lance was the classic latchkey kid.
His mother left notes whenever she needed to tell him something. So Lance mostly was raised by babysitters.
The absence of his parents, particularly his mother, seemed to affect Lance's ability to foster lasting relationships with the opposite sex.
It goes back to that lack of relationship with his mother. He was still trying to fill that void that was missing. He really did not know how to relate to women.
But one thing Lance did learn from his parents was the value of hard work. Lance poured his heart and soul into his professional life.
Lance Herndon was a very bright man, a very driven man, a very disciplined man.
Lance moved to Atlanta to pursue a career in computer science, and then he started his own company, Access Inc., which staffed computer staff personnel to different companies.
And in his 30s, his hard work and unparalleled salesmanship netted him some highly coveted customers.
Lance had some really impressive clients. IBM, Nations Bank, Citibank, Coca-Cola.
He was considered one of the top 100 black entrepreneurs in the country.
With his business booming, Lance built his dream home, a colonial-style estate in the North Cliff neighborhood of Roswell that also acted as the headquarters for his company.
The top floors were reserved for their private home, and Access Inc. was in the basement.
It wasn't just Lance's business that was booming. For a man who'd previously had trouble hitting it off with the opposite sex, Lance's multi-million-dollar company and sprawling estate certainly made it easier for him to connect with the ladies.
He had a lot of money. And for someone with power and stature, Atlanta was ripe for the picking for women.
I think he couldn't help it. He seemed to care for the girls, but he wasn't satisfied. He was addicted. He needed more and more and more.
By the time he was 40, Lance had been married and divorced 3 times. But even though he seemed addicted to the Playboy lifestyle, Lance longed to meet that special someone.
Lance needed to be loved. He was still trying to fill that void that was missing.
Lance celebrated his 41st birthday with a lavish party. It was there that he was introduced to an Atlanta bombshell he'd never seen before.
Lance, meet my friend Dion.
Dion.
29-year-old Dion Baugh.
Happy birthday. Thank you.
The two connected instantly.
Dion was from Jamaica. She was petite. She was attractive. She was enrolled in college at Georgia State. And I think it's fair to say that Dion wanted to climb to heights that she had not achieved in her life.
Lance was intrigued by Dion. He liked small, petite, fair-skinned women. She had this Jamaican accent that made her exotic, and the relationship took off suddenly.
The Jamaican beauty and the Peachtree City power player soon became inseparable, though most of the couple's time together was spent in the bedroom.
He met his match with Dion. He told people that she satisfied him in a way that no one else satisfied him.
I love him good.
In exchange for nurturing him both sexually and emotionally, Lance showered Dion with lavish trips and luxurious gifts.
Oh my God, baby.
And even helped pay for her schooling. Anything Dion desired was hers for the asking.
He started to buy her jewelry and expensive gifts and bought her a brand new Mercedes.
She really thought, I made it. I have struck it rich. I love him. He loves me. I'm going to marry him.
But just as Dion and Lance seemed ready to tie the knot, their relationship was cut short in brutal fashion. It starts when Lance's mother reports finding his body in his palatial master bedroom early on the morning of August 8, 1996.
She has found her son dead, naked, in bed, bludgeoned to death.
But as police begin to dissect the scene, they'll soon discover that Lance Herndon's life of luxury did more than allow him to land the woman of his dreams. It also allowed him to indulge other dark fantasies that may have led to murder.
He was such a well-respected businessman. Nobody really would have guessed that he had this kind of seedy sex life behind the scenes.
Lance Herndon was considered one of Atlanta's top businessmen.
He really did embody the entrepreneurial spirit of African Americans during the 90s.
But while Lance succeeded in business, his personal life was less fortunate. That is, until he met a 29-year-old Jamaican-born beauty named Dion Baugh.
She was very fair-skinned. She was from the islands. It was an eye candy, another eye candy for him. It was a chase for him.
But Lance and Dion's red-hot romance was snuffed out when Lance's mother discovered her son's dead body in the master suite of his sprawling suburban mansion.
There is blood all over the bedroom, and Lance Herndon has been bludgeoned to death.
His skull had been smashed multiple times. He'd been beaten brutally.
Judging from the state of rigor mortis, it appears Lance had been dead 5 to 7 hours. But as they survey the scene inside the opulent master bedroom, investigators can't help but wonder if someone targeted the dashing businessman for his money.
Lance Herndon had become a very powerful man. He was very successful. He was making money, and people recognized him.
But an initial search of Lance's residence suggests otherwise.
Nothing of value is missing. His wallet is on the table. Money's still in it. His IDs are still there. Everything of value is still in place.
But in Lance's office, investigators determined there is one item of value missing.
That might be a laptop.
Yeah.
Check that bag.
They noticed his laptop wasn't there.
Lance was a shrewd businessman in the dog-eat-dog world of technology. Is it possible his murder was the work of an adversary looking to take out their primary competition?
He also had other things going on from a business standpoint that could have created other suspects in this case, other people that had an axe to grind with him, other people that broadened the field of suspects.
According to Lance's mother, who made the initial 911 call, the idea that her son was loathed by his competitors doesn't hold water.
They're telling the police everything that they know about Lance. They don't think he has any enemies. He got along with everybody and he was very well respected.
And as investigators survey Lance's battered corpse, they begin to see another, more personal motive behind the crime.
The police theory was that it was a crime of passion, meaning someone was very upset or mad because they didn't strike him once or twice, but actually many times.
Detectives also notice a few other strange clues scattered around Lance's bedroom.
There was a couple of porn tapes. There were condoms on a dresser or on a counter.
He's obviously in bed when he's killed. Whether he's in bed when the person arrived or not, it's not clear.
The pattern of the blood. It was a V pattern that even extended to the ceiling. And so this theory was that whoever committed this crime was straddling Lance and was hailing down these terribly violent blows in a very forceful way.
The murder weapon is nowhere to be found, but Lance's housekeeper offers police a possible clue.
The maid tells police that a large crescent wrench is missing from the house. It had been there consistently every day, and all of a sudden it was missing. So they think that could possibly be the weapon, but they can't find it.
The missing crescent wrench isn't the only roadblock investigators have hit. There's little in the way of physical evidence, save for a single hair found on Lance's abdomen.
Other than the pubic hair that was found on Lance Herndon's body, the police investigators found very little direct evidence to link to the murder.
But that single hair, combined with the apparently intimate nature of the crime, has investigators angling to speak to just one person, Lance's girlfriend, Dion Baugh.
I think they ended up focusing on Dion Baugh reasonably quickly. Lance was a person that she was admitted to being sexually active with.
Locating her at home in Norcross, investigators informed Dion of her lover's death.
Hey guys, what's going on?
Here to advise you that Lance Herndon has passed.
She's crying, she's hysterical, she collapses in the yard. She's hysterical on the ground, screaming about Lance.
Although Dion seems genuinely devastated, detectives still have a few questions and bring her into the station for a formal interview. Once at the station, detectives take a much more aggressive stance.
They interrogated Dion for hours, and she denied that she had anything to do with it.
She painted her relationship with Lance as a rosy one, that they had a great relationship.
Dion admits to police that she saw Lance the evening he was killed, but Dion claims they got together at her house, not at Lance's estate. Dion's statement also explains where the missing laptop went.
She acknowledges that he had dropped by and brought her his laptop computer because she needed to use it for her schoolwork. And the time frame that she gave was between 9 and 10:30 p.m. that night.
According to Dion, Lance wanted desperately to spend the night with her, but she needed to study.
Lance wanted to stay with her, according to Dion, and she was devastated that she didn't spend that last night with him.
I've gone over in my mind so many times, I wish I'd let him stay with me. I wish I'd let him stay with her.
Based on Dion's statement, investigators believe she is telling the truth. And given the fact that they weren't married, Dion has no apparent motive to murder her lover.
He was probably worth more to her alive than dead.
But just as they are wrapping up the interview, Dion reveals a piece of shocking information.
Did you know many of his friends?
No, and I purposely wanted it that way, so I didn't want people to see me with him and knowing that I was married. I did that for my own protection. Right.
Police were shocked. Dion was married. She was married to a man named Sean Nelson, a Jamaican pilot, and they had had a daughter who was 4 years old.
He lived in Jamaica, but even still, he and Dion continued their relationship. It was a commuter relationship.
He loved Dion. He was faithful to Dion, and he thought that she was faithful to him.
But during her interview with police, Dion admits that over time, Sean began to suspect she was seeing someone behind his back, someone wealthy.
He comes in town, he discovers that his wife has some designer clothing and is now driving a brand new car.
He knew she couldn't afford that, and I think they realized that she had to have a sugar daddy somewhere.
Dion says the situation came to a head shortly before Lance's death.
Yes, who is this?
There was one point where Sean had come in from Jamaica to visit Dion, and the phone rang, and it was Lance calling Dion.
Sean starts asking, "Who are you?" And Lance is asking him, "Who are you?"
This is her husband, Sean.
Wait a minute. Dion.
A fight started over the phone, and I think Lance said something pretty aggressive, like, "You better watch your back," or something. And apparently, Sean was really, really afraid.
The fact that Dion's husband, Sean, knew about her affair shoots him to the top of the suspect list.
Sean would have also been a natural suspect because he could have just either murdered Lance himself or hired someone to do it.
But in order to speak to Dion's husband, investigators must venture into international waters, where a few, even more sinister secrets lay hidden beneath the surface.
Don't see murder cases like this. A real, honest-to-God whodunit is actually pretty rare these days.
In the posh suburbs of Atlanta, millionaire businessman Lance Herndon and his Jamaican lover Dion Baugh shared a life few could imagine.
He wanted to just open up Atlanta to her, so he took her out. He spent a lot of money, and he courted her, and she responded to that.
But when Lance is found brutally murdered in his own bedroom, investigators question Dion and learn the couple's relationship wasn't everything it appeared to be.
Dion was actually married. She had a husband named Sean who lived in Jamaica with their 4-year-old daughter.
This is Sean.
Not only that, but according to Dion, shortly before the murder, Lance and her husband had a heated exchange.
Don't ever call my house again.
Maybe I won't call. Maybe I'll just come over there. How about that?
Don't ever call my house again.
Within this conversation, between the screaming and yelling, threats were made.
Dion also informs police that Sean was actually in town the day of the murder.
Sean had been in Atlanta visiting Dion just before the murder. How ironic that he left for Jamaica the evening Lance was killed.
Police are anxious to talk to Sean Nelson, but Dion explains that Sean technically still lives in Jamaica.
Once an unalibied suspect leaves the country, concrete leads may quickly deteriorate. Continuing the investigation brings on legal, economic, and time constraints.
But with the help of Sean's airline employer, detectives are able to track him down. They make the trip to Jamaica to interview Sean at his home.
Can I help you?
The investigation was very thorough. They did go to Jamaica. They interviewed her husband down there, found out a lot about what happened.
Sean readily admits his wife's affair left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he's adamant he had nothing to do with Lance's death.
I hated him. I hate what he did to my family.
As detectives continue their conversation, it becomes evident Sean couldn't have committed the crime.
Time of death indicates Lance was killed sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. By this time, Sean was already heading back to Jamaica. In fact, he had already landed.
Thank you very much.
With their investigation at a standstill, detectives reach out to friends and family for more information about their victim. In doing so, they unearth another unexpected surprise. Turns out Dion wasn't the only one juggling multiple lovers. Not by a long shot.
They said that they couldn't keep up with the amount of people that he was sleeping with.
Lance had a harem of women, and he saw women as objects and someone that he could lay with, play with, and when he was finished, he would put them aside and he'd pick up the next one.
But in Lance Herndon's binders full of women, one appears to stand out. a gorgeous brunette named Kathy Connor he met at a party.
Kathy was beautiful. She knew how to stand, how to sit. Very classy lady, and he enjoyed having Kathy on his arm.
But it's not Kathy's good looks that pique investigators' interest.
Police processing the scene find a picture of a woman, a beautiful woman dressed in a white gown. The woman is Kathy.
According to Lance's friends, Lance was as hot and heavy with Kathy as he was with Dion.
She had the clothes in the closet. She was allowed to stay over when other women had to leave after he was finished.
Kathy was what most would have considered his sort of trophy. If you saw Lance out at a formal event, it was probably with Kathy. She was definitely eye candy for him publicly.
Which, to investigators, explains the real reason Lance and Dion weren't living together and why they seemed to spend most of their time getting it on in the bedroom rather than hitting the town.
Kathy did not know about Dion. Dion did not know about Kathy.
Is it possible that Kathy eventually found out about Dion and murdered Lance in a jealous rage?
Obviously, Lance had cheated on her quite a bit, so she would have been a natural suspect as well.
But detectives don't have to wait long for a chance to speak with Kathy. 1 week into the investigation, she storms into the police station.
She sashays in, she sits down, and she's mad. She's upset because the police have not allowed her to go back into the home to get her clothes. So the police are thinking this woman is more concerned about her expensive clothes than she is her boyfriend.
Investigators cut to the chase.
So where were you that night?
She tells them that she was going to spend the night with another millionaire.
Detectives look into Kathy's story and determine she did indeed spend the evening with her other lover, another of Atlanta's wealthiest black businessmen.
Police were able to verify everything that Kathy said, so she was ruled out.
With Kathy Connor in the clear, investigators turn to the next woman on Lance Herndon's overflowing Rolodex of lovers. One who appears to be the wildest and perhaps most lethal of them all.
Lance would lend her to his friends. She basically would do anything that he asked of her in exchange for financial gain.
In a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, detectives are on the hunt for the killer of wealthy businessman Lance Herndon. And after running down a pair of rival girlfriends and one jealous husband, they're now focusing on the millionaire playboy's vast portfolio of lovers.
I think it's probably fair to say that Lance's bedroom had a revolving door.
The suspect pool for the investigation involved mostly all women.
But in speaking to Lance's friends and family, there's one name in that pool that keeps popping up. Lance's part-time assistant, Lacey Brown.
It was reputed that they had a romantic or sexual relationship that was ongoing for quite some time.
Investigators ask Lacey to come by the station for an interview. Lacey agrees, but when she arrives, she's not alone.
Lacey knew that her story might be questioned, so she showed up. She had an attorney.
Obviously, as her counsel, we're going to reserve the right to stop this interrogation or interview at any point in time.
Some people may look at the fact that Lacey showed up to the interrogation with a lawyer as partly guilt.
First initial question is, what kind of relation did you have with him?
It was sexual as well, just purely sexual.
Okay, and when's the last time you seen him?
Actually, the night that he was murdered.
Lacey tells the police that she was with Lance on the night of the murder.
He was sleeping with Lacey. She could have killed Lance.
But Lacey insists she's innocent of any crime. She says she left Lance's house around 10 p.m. on the night in question, with Lance very much alive at the time. Lacey also claims she spoke with Lance again via phone shortly after she arrived home.
They chatted for just a bit, and when she hung up, around 10:30 or 11 or so, that was the last time she spoke with him.
Investigators are puzzled. Lacey Brown's alibi places her with Lance Herndon at the exact same time another potential suspect claimed to be with Lance, Dion Baugh.
Dion said he had dropped by and brought her his laptop computer because she needed to use it for her schoolwork. And the time frame that she gave was between 9 and 10:30 p.m. that night.
Not only does Lacey's alibi conflict with Dion Baugh's, but Lacey also claims that Lance was still using his laptop when she left that night, which further contradicts Dion's story that Lance dropped the laptop off with her around 10 p.m.
Lacey and Dion both say that they were with Lance at the same time. Obviously, that's not possible. Somebody is lying.
Investigators decide the best way to figure out who's telling the truth is to take a closer look at both women. In doing so, they uncover a startling report detailing an incident that occurred at Lance Herndon's estate just 1 month prior to his death. An incident involving Dion Baugh and another of Lance's lovers, Kathy Connor.
Dion had been calling Lance throughout the day, and he was not responding to her calls. And so at some point, she decided just to show up at his house. And unfortunately, they both got a big surprise.
When she got there, she looked in the window and she saw Lance and Kathy inside the home.
What are you doing?
Kathy knows nothing about Dion. She has no idea who this woman is. And Dion doesn't know who Kathy is. She thinks she's the only one.
Open the door! I need to talk to you!
No!
Please!
No!
Lance has found himself in a predicament here that he had created all by himself. Well, he couldn't tell Kathy who Dion was, and so he had to play this off as some kind of stalker or intruder, and as a result, he called the police.
Hey, there's somebody knocking at my door, and it might be like an ex-girlfriend or whatever. Mm-hmm. And to give me some problems.
Okay, send somebody out there and have them leave the premises, okay?
They arrested her. They took her away. And I believe that Dion was charged with trespassing and resisting arrest.
But the following morning, perhaps out of guilt, Lance bailed Dion out of jail.
He told Dion that he was going to go to court on her behalf and that he was going to try and get her exonerated of the charges.
They had some trust issues after that moment. They continued to see one another, but I think Lance was walking on eggshells with her, and I think that she no longer trusted Lance.
With so many conflicting stories and a laundry list of jilted lovers, detectives turn their attention to the sole piece of forensic evidence at their disposal: the pubic hair recovered from Lance Herndon's body.
Because Lance was sleeping with several women, the investigators took DNA samples from 3 of the women that Lance had been with: Lacey, Dion, and Kathy. It was obvious that some DNA would be found on his body. The question was, whose DNA would it be?
Millionaire playboy Lance Herndon has been brutally bludgeoned to death by an unknown assailant. Police have learned that Lance's red-hot love triangle with Kathy Connor and Dion Baugh exploded just weeks before his death, when Dion dropped by his home unannounced.
When she arrived and looked in the window and apparently created a scene in which he wouldn't go to the door, and he just called police and they arrested her.
Okay, officer, I'll go.
But following Dion's arrest, Lance bailed her out and promised to have the charges against her dropped.
What he really did was he set in motion a series of events that led to his own murder.
Either the living girlfriend who's grown tired of her $1 million gigolo, or the Jamaican beauty he's groomed to Atlanta socialite status. Which of these women had more reason to orchestrate his murder?
Adding to the intrigue is the fact that a third woman, Lance's assistant, Lacey Brown, has also admitted to sleeping with him and has been placed at Lance's house the night of the crime.
How does one get to the bottom of this case? We have 3 scorned women, all with plausible motivation to commit murder.
But a single hair found at the crime scene may just crack this case wide open. Weeks into the investigation, detectives received the results from the state crime lab.
The DNA test actually came back that it was a match to Dion Baugh.
With this confirmation, police are confident Dion is the killer. Later that day, Dion Baugh is charged with the murder of her lover, Lance Herndon. News of the arrest and of the victim's posh address make waves all over the city of Atlanta.
A lot of people were very fascinated by who the victim was, what kind of lifestyle he had. That generated a lot of interest.
That interest reaches a crescendo at Dion's trial.
An African-American millionaire playboy murdered. This case impacted both the have and have-nots in the city. Everyone wanted to know how this case would play out.
Prosecutors opened by laying out Dion's alleged motive. After catching Lance with Kathy Connor, Dion feared Lance was planning to put an end to both the relationship and with it, Dion's lavish lifestyle.
The prosecutor theory was he was basically going to dump her, take his car back, take everything back.
Prosecutors claim Dion also feared Lance was going to renege on his promise to have the trespassing charges against her dropped.
Lance always had his day scheduled on his computer. When Dion looked on the computer and didn't see her court date on his calendar, she went into a rage. That was the ultimate rejection.
Prosecutors claim that in order to carry out the crime, Dion plied Lance with the one thing he could never say no to.
Dion, what are you doing here?
Sex.
I know you miss me.
The way the state contended the murder occurred was that Dion had sex with Lance. Lance went to sleep. That Dion started going through a computer and saw that Lance had not scheduled to go to the hearing on the misdemeanor, criminal battery, and that this enraged Dion.
She straddled him in his bed as he slept, and she bludgeoned him to death at a minimum of 12 times.
To support their claim, prosecutors introduced the hair they found on Lance's dead body, the hair that DNA testing proves belongs to Dion.
Certainly the strongest evidence that the prosecution had was the DNA evidence.
But when it's their turn, Dion's attorneys take aim at the DNA evidence.
There was no doubt that Dion Ball was having a love affair with Lance Herndon. Of course there's going to be DNA evidence in his bed.
They dated, they were intimate, and he could have rolled around and it could have been stuck to his body.
The prosecution counters by submitting the report from the incident that took place 1 month prior to the murder, which they say clearly paints Dion as a vindictive and potentially violent person.
Dion's arrest at Lance's home made her appear very angry. So angry that she was attempting to force her way inside his home. This displayed anger showed her ability to act out violently.
In addition to the incident report, prosecutors call one of the case's lead investigators to the stand, who recounts a slew of unflattering stories about Dion. Many of them relate to him by her and Lance's friends and family.
Investigator Anastasio's comments to the witnesses were based on the type of person Dion was, rather than if the individual was there to commit murder. Most witnesses felt Dion was crazy, a person that couldn't be trusted, so therefore she had to commit the murder.
Lieutenant Anastasio testified to a lot of information that he heard from other parties, from the neighbors of Dion Bow, from people who knew Dion Bow, and from people who knew Lance Herndon.
Defense lawyers are outraged that the judge has allowed such testimony.
It was blatantly hearsay, it was bolstering, it was a violation of the evidentiary rules.
If the prosecution wanted to introduce the evidence of those people, he should call those witnesses to the stand.
But the judge allows the detectives' words to stand. With their backs against the ropes, the defense tries to chip away at Dion's alleged motive.
Criminal trespass, which is only a misdemeanor, is a small crime. It didn't make sense that that would lead Dion to kill Lance because he'd reneged on a misdemeanor agreement.
As for the jealousy motive, the defense argues that given Lance's voracious sexual appetite, the line of women who might want to exact some sort of revenge against him is long.
There are all these women who'd been jilted over the years, and he's got so many women bouncing back and forth every night. There were lots of people who had the ability to actually have been the perpetrator in the case.
After tackling the motive, the defense hammers away at the lack of physical evidence connecting Dion to the crime.
There's nothing that directly links her to that scene at the moment of the murder.
nor is there a murder weapon implicating Dion.
They didn't find it. I believe, in fact, that they attempted to dig up the backyard of her home and went back there and went to her home and never found anything.
The defense's case is so solid, the seeds of doubt so strong, it seems a guilty verdict is all but impossible.
Just the fact that Dion's hair was found on Lance was not going to be sufficient to convince a jury that she was guilty. It wasn't enough evidence.
Which makes the legal thunderbolt that strikes next all the more shocking.
I've tried a lot of murder cases in the last 32 years. This is unusual. It's not the normal way in which a trial ends.
The case was certainly shocking. We were shocked by the jury.
After 2 weeks of testimony, Dion Ball's murder trial for the death of her Playboy lover, Lance Herndon, is drawing to a close. In a case based almost solely on circumstantial evidence, a guilty verdict seems far from certain.
The defense had a strong argument for reasonable doubt.
No murder weapon, no one actually putting Dion in Lance's home the evening he was killed.
Dion's fate now rests in the hands of the jury. After only a couple of hours of deliberation, they announce they've reached a verdict. They find Dion Ball guilty of murder.
She was convicted of murder, and in Georgia, that's an automatic life sentence.
It was a compliment to the prosecutor because all they had tying Dion Ball to the crime was a hair and some DNA on a person that she had admitted to being sexually active with.
Dion was very cool during the entire trial, but when the verdict was handed down, she wept.
Outraged over what he feels was inadmissible testimony on the part of Detective Anastasio, defense attorney Don Samuel appeals the verdict.
It's not proper to call a policeman to the stand and have him simply repeat what witnesses told him. That's hearsay.
With Dion locked up in prison, the appeal eventually makes its way to the Georgia Supreme Court.
It took well over a year for the Supreme Court to decide the case. She was very hopeful of getting a new trial, insisted on her innocence throughout.
On July 10th, 2003, 2 years after her sentencing, the Georgia Supreme Court announces their decision. The jury's original verdict is overturned.
And the Supreme Court agreed with the defense. And so they sent the case back for retrial.
As in the first trial, Dion's defense team attacks the lack of physical evidence. But this time, they also launch a full-on assault on Lance Herndon's character.
During the second trial, the defense was able to puncture Lance's character even more and create a broader landscape of enemies that he may have had.
Usually it is the advantage of the defense to have a second trial because you've learned all the state's secrets by then.
Still, everyone in the jury believes Dion to be guilty, except for one.
There was one juror who just couldn't find it in their heart to find her guilty.
And that's all it takes. All it takes is one hung juror, and you're not acquitted, but you're also not convicted. So the trial ends, and everybody goes home. You start over again.
The prospect of a third trial takes its toll on everyone, including Lance Herndon's family.
They were tired of hearing Lance Herndon being kind of dragged through the mud. So the prosecutors said, let's see if we can reach a settlement that everybody can live with. And that's what happened.
Dion was floated an offer by the state of voluntary manslaughter with a sentence of 10 years in prison.
Having served 2 years while her case was on appeal, Dion takes the deal.
She decided to cut her losses. In one case, she was convicted, and another time she had a mistrial. And she didn't want to roll the dice one more time and took the 10 years.
In July of 2011, after completing her sentence, Dion Ball walks out of jail a free woman. But questions about her guilt or innocence linger to this day.
I wouldn't stake my life on the fact that Dion was the killer in this case. There was just too many question marks.
And while the truth of what really happened that fateful night in Lance Herndon...
The humid air of July 1979 in New York City wasn't just thick with summer heat. It was heavy with an impending sense of dread. In the cramped, decaying walk-up apartments of the Lower East Side, life moved with a desperate, frantic rhythm. But for 22-year-old Clara Thorne, that rhythm came to a violent, suffocating halt on a Tuesday night that would remain etched in the city's dark history for nearly half a century. Clara was the kind of person who seemed destined to rise above the grid of the streets, an aspiring archivist with a penchant for quiet corners and forgotten stories, a girl who saw beauty in the dust of old records. But on that July evening, she became the subject of a record that would stay closed, locked, and gathering its own metaphorical dust for decades. When her body was discovered in the meticulously staged solitude of her own living room, the lack of forced entry and the chilling, deliberate placement of her belongings suggested a killer who didn't just strike in a fit of rage, but one who moved with a terrifying, predatory patience. The city buzzed with the usual chaos, but the detectives assigned to the Thorne case found themselves chasing ghosts in a labyrinth of brick and shadows, staring at a crime scene that offered everything in terms of atmosphere and nothing in terms of substance. The initial investigation was a masterclass in mid-70s procedural futility. Forensic science was in its infancy, a toolkit of dusting for prints and hoping for a stray hair that hadn't been trampled by the inevitable rush of responding officers. Detectives combed through the neighborhood, their flashlights cutting through the gloom of fire escapes, questioning residents who lived behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Every person in Clara's life, her soft-spoken librarian colleague, the landlord with the restless eyes, the ex-boyfriend who swore he was across town at a smoky jazz club, was brought into the interrogation room, their stories dismantled, analyzed, and eventually discarded. The atmosphere in the precinct was one of suppressed hysteria. A young woman had been erased from existence, and the killer had walked out the front door, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo through the police station halls. As the weeks turned into months, the leads dried up like puddles on the hot asphalt. The case shifted from the front page to the interior back pages, and eventually, it vanished entirely into the bottomless pit of the unsolved file cabinet. Years bled into decades, and the city underwent a violent, tectonic transformation. The grit of 1979 was scrubbed away by gentrification, the Lower East Side evolved into a playground for the wealthy, and the buildings where Clara once lived were gutted and renovated into luxury lofts. The physical landscape of the crime had been erased, but the cold case remained a festering, unresolved wound in the collective memory of the few who still remembered. Detectives retired, the lead investigator passed away, and the file on Clara Thorne became a relic of a different era, a ghost story told in the quiet corners of the precinct to warn rookies about the fragility of justice. Then, in the twilight of 2025, the impossible happened. A hospital room in rural Vermont, silent and sterile, became the unlikely stage for a final, earth-shattering confession. An elderly man, clinging to the fading embers of his life, dictated an anonymous letter, a desperate, tremulous apology to the universe that would eventually land on a desk in Manhattan, smelling of old paper and the finality of the grave. The letter was a rambling, incoherent mess of regret and specific, chilling detail. It spoke of a night in 1979, the smell of summer rain on hot pavement and the cold, unyielding decision to take a life that had done nothing but exist. It didn't just name the killer. It mapped out a psychological profile of a man who had lived his entire adult life under the crushing weight of a secret he couldn't share. The letter provided details that had never been released to the public, the precise location of a missing locket, the specific way the blinds had been drawn, the chilling, clinical detail of the struggle that left no physical marks, but silenced a soul. When the cold case unit received the document, they didn't just open a file, they opened a gateway into a past that everyone had assumed was dead and buried. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the revelation was a thunderclap that ripped through the cold, calculated silence of the archive room, demanding a reckoning that the system had long ago abandoned. The reopening of the Thorne case was not a gradual process. It was a violent, high-speed collision between the past and the present. Teams of forensic experts, equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators of 1979, swarmed the digital archives, cross-referencing the letter's claims with the microscopic, preserved evidence that had remained in the property locker for 46 years. They found the trace DNA, a tiny, degraded sample that had been ignored in a world of limited testing, and matched it to the family of the man mentioned in the deathbed confession. The shockwave reached the descendants of a killer, people who had grown up loving a man they thought was a pillar of their community, a man who had coached Little League and volunteered at the local parish. They were forced to confront the fact that their family history was built on a foundation of blood, a revelation that broke their world into jagged, irreparable pieces. As the detectives worked to corroborate the confession, the media descended on the neighborhood like a swarm of vultures. The New York City news cycle, usually obsessed with the present, found itself captivated by the ghost of 1979. Headlines screamed about the deathbed confession and the killer in the shadows, turning the memory of Clara Thorne into a modern-day myth. The investigation revealed that the killer had lived just 6 blocks away from the crime scene for 30 years, a fact that sent a shudder of revulsion through the community. People who had lived in the neighborhood for decades began looking at their neighbors, their friends, their elderly relatives with a sudden, sharp, and terrifying suspicion. The crime had been solved, but the peace of mind of an entire city had been shattered in the process. It wasn't just about the murder anymore. It was about the realization that monsters don't always live in the dark. Sometimes they live in the light, right next door, hiding behind the mask of a mundane existence. The legal proceedings were a somber, procedural chore that felt almost secondary to the emotional devastation left in the wake of the confession. With the killer dead, there would be no trial, no gavel drop, no final moment of public justice that would satisfy the families. There was only the process of validating the truth, a process that felt increasingly hollow as the detectives realized they were chasing a shadow that had already checked out of existence. They held a small, private meeting with Clara's surviving relatives, presenting them with the final, ugly truth they had been denied for almost half a century. The tears shed in that room weren't just for Clara. They were for the decades of what-ifs, for the hollow feeling of wondering if the world had simply forgotten that she ever lived. The confession brought closure, but it was a cold, hard, and unsatisfying closure that left more questions in its wake than it answered. The final report on the Thorne case is a thick, exhaustive document that catalogs the failure of the past and the desperate, late-stage efficiency of the present. It stands as a testament to the fact that secrets have a shelf life, but they rarely stay buried forever. The case has become a permanent exhibit in the halls of the NYPD, used to demonstrate that the passage of time is not an excuse for the cessation of inquiry. The detectives who worked the final months of the investigation have moved on to other cases, but they carry the weight of Clara Thorne with them, a reminder that every cold case is a living, breathing entity that waits for the light of day. The Lower East Side has moved on, the luxury lofts remain, and the city hums with its usual, uncaring energy, but for a brief moment, the ghost of 1979 walked among us, demanding to be remembered, demanding that the truth, however late, finally be allowed to speak. The resolution of the Thorne case left a vacuum in the narrative of New York crime, a silence that felt heavier than the initial murder. Every day, people walk past the intersection where Clara once lived, unaware that beneath the feet of the trendy shoppers and the busy commuters, the soil holds the memory of a tragedy that spanned generations. The deathbed letter, once a secret held by one dying man, became a public record, a piece of paper that redefined the lives of everyone it touched. It changed the way detectives look at the files sitting on their desks, the ones covered in dust and forgotten by time. It changed the way families think about their history. It changed the very definition of a cold case, shifting it from a case closed to a case finally understood. As the investigation into the Thorne case officially wound down, a strange, lingering atmosphere settled over the precinct. The detectives, having finally finished the final paperwork, found themselves staring at the empty file cabinet, the space where the Thorne file had sat for decades. It was a physical representation of an absence, a hole where a life and a secret had once been housed. They didn't feel like celebrating. They felt a strange, melancholy sense of loss, as if by solving the case, they had somehow killed the ghost that had become their silent companion. The case was solved, but the memory of it, the raw, unfiltered, and deeply human tragedy of it, remained, a ghost that would continue to haunt the halls of the precinct long after they had all retired and moved on to other, louder, and perhaps less significant mysteries. The final word on the Thorne case is not found in the legal report or the autopsy records. It is found in the way the city continues to move, oblivious and indifferent to the ghosts beneath its surface. The resolution of the case wasn't a triumph. It was a realization, a stark and brutal reminder that justice is not a destination but a process that never truly ends. Clara Thorne is no longer a missing person or an unsolved file. She's a memory, a story told in the quiet corners of a city that rarely stops to listen. And as the sun sets over the Lower East Side, the lights in the luxury lofts flicker on, casting long, dark shadows over the streets where she once walked, reminding us that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to break through the silence and make itself known, once and for all. The revelation of the anonymous deathbed letter sent a shockwave through the NYPD's cold case unit that was felt in every department, from the precinct captains to the forensic lab technicians. It wasn't just the fact that a name had finally been surfaced after 46 years of sterile silence. It was the chilling, intimate nature of the confession that defied logic. The letter, typed on an ancient, ribbon-worn machine, didn't just confess. It lectured. It spoke of the 1979 New York heat with a haunting, visceral precision, describing the scent of the garbage-strewn alleys of the Lower East Side, the specific, rhythmic hum of the subway cars passing underneath the tenements, and the exact, terrifying sequence of events that led to Clara Thorne's final moments in her third-floor apartment. The letter author, who identified himself only as a watcher, detailed the vulnerability of a city that had been pushed to its breaking point, where crime was a casual currency and a young woman's life could be extinguished by a complete stranger without anyone even looking up from their evening commute. For the detectives who had inherited the Thorne file, the letter was not just a document. It was a roadmap to a crime scene that had been physically demolished decades ago. They spent the first 72 hours in a state of frantic, caffeine-fueled analysis, cross-referencing every claim the letter made against the original, handwritten case notes from 1979. The notes were archaic, faded ink on crumbling, yellowed paper, filled with the clipped, cynical prose of detectives who had seen too much and expected too little. Yet, when compared, the letter's assertions about the apartment's interior layout, the specific placement of Clara's books, and even a minor, undocumented detail about a missing silver pendant matched the original crime scene photographs with a degree of accuracy that excluded the possibility of a prank. The killer, in his final act of self-preservation or perhaps self-loathing, had provided the key to a door that had been welded shut for nearly half a century. The investigation moved outward from the document into the personal lives of the potential suspects who had been interviewed during the initial investigation in the summer of 1979. These were men who, in the intervening years, had lived out full lives. Some had succumbed to the ravages of age, others had moved to the suburbs, and some had continued to exist in the margins of society. The task force began the grueling, methodical work of tracking down their descendants, navigating the complicated family trees of people who had long ago tried to bury the memory of that summer. The process was a delicate, high-stakes negotiation with the past. Every door knocked on, every archived birth certificate requested, and every digitized pension record scanned felt like a strike against a legacy of silence that had been carefully curated for generations. The detectives knew that one false move, one premature notification to the press, could blow the case wide open, causing the remaining threads of the truth to fray beyond repair. In the middle of this investigation, the city itself seemed to conspire to keep its secrets. New York is a place that thrives on constant, relentless reinvention, a city where the past is routinely bulldozed to make room for the next glass and steel monstrosity. The detectives found themselves wandering through neighborhoods that were entirely unrecognizable, guided only by maps that existed in their files, searching for the ghosts of buildings that had been replaced by artisanal coffee shops and boutique fitness studios. The contrast was jarring, the brutal, visceral violence of 1979 versus the polished, sanitized aesthetic of the modern Lower East Side. It felt like they were trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces didn't just fit poorly. They belonged to an entirely different, perhaps extinct, world. The disconnect made the letter's clarity even more startling. While the city had moved on, the crime had remained frozen in a state of permanent, agonizing suspension. As the detectives delved deeper, they discovered a disturbing pattern that the original investigators had missed. The letter wasn't the work of an impulsive, opportunistic killer. The precision of the violence, the lack of forced entry, and the way the scene had been arranged spoke to a level of obsession that was, in its own way, more terrifying than a crime of passion. The letter writer hadn't just killed Clara Thorne. He had spent the time between the crime and his deathbed reflecting on it, almost as if he were cataloging her final moments as the defining achievement of his own existence. The detectives found journals in the estate of a man who fit the letter's timeline, a man who had worked as a night shift janitor in the same building as Clara. These journals were filled with sketches, not of people, but of shadows, of doorways, of the way the light fell across the floor at specific times of the evening. It was the diary of a predator, a man who saw the city not as a community, but as a vast, interconnected gallery of potential victims. The emotional toll on the detectives involved in the Thorne case was immense. They weren't just solving a murder, they were excavating a lifetime of repressed trauma. They had to sit down with the elderly survivors who had known Clara, people who had spent decades keeping her name alive in their own private, quiet ways. Hearing these stories, the way Clara loved the smell of old paper, the way she dreamed of being a lead researcher in the city's grand archives, the specific way she laughed at her own jokes, made the task of closing the case feel both more urgent and more heartbreaking. They realized that they weren't just closing a file, they were completing a story that had been cut short in the middle of a sentence. The detectives became a conduit for the grief that had been dammed up for 46 years, a dam that had finally burst with the arrival of that single, anonymous letter. The media's involvement, while helpful in generating leads, also brought a chaotic energy that the detectives had to constantly manage. Every news cycle brought new theories, new, self-appointed experts on true crime, and a frenzy of speculation that threatened to distract from the factual evidence. They had to maintain a firewall between the sensationalism of the press and the clinical reality of the investigation. The pressure was compounded by the fact that they were racing against time. The biological evidence was decaying, and the remaining witnesses were fading. Every day that passed was a day where the truth could be further obscured by the fog of failing memories and the sheer, unstoppable march of history. It was a race against the inevitable, a high-stakes struggle to ensure that the letter's final confession was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a genuine, ironclad resolution. The process of corroboration required the detectives to look beyond the letter, to seek out any shred of evidence that could link the killer to the apartment in 1979. They found it in the most unlikely place, a box of donated clothing that had been sitting in an attic in Connecticut for 30 years. Tucked into the pocket of a discarded coat was a receipt for a service that Clara had used the very week she disappeared. The receipt had been stamped with a signature that, when examined by a modern-day forensic handwriting expert, matched the writing of the man who had authored the deathbed letter. The connection was thin, a thread of paper, but it was enough to solidify the timeline. The killer had been in her apartment. He had been in contact with her, and he had been there in the days leading up to the act that would define the rest of his life. The receipt was the physical manifestation of the letter's truth, the final piece of evidence that turned a confession into a legal reality. As the detectives stood in the evidence room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that ended in 1979, the weight of their achievement finally settled in. They had done what everyone said was impossible. They had reopened a locked door and forced the truth out into the cold, hard light of the 21st century. They hadn't just solved a case. They had restored a measure of order to a chaotic world. They had proven that the past is not a foreign country, but a part of our own, a layer of reality that is constantly pressing against the present, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The Thorne case wasn't just a cold case. It was a testament to the fact that even when the trail goes cold, the truth never stops waiting, never stops calling out, and never stops demanding to be heard. The final weeks of the investigation were spent preparing the formal findings, a document that would serve as the definitive record of Clara Thorne's final days. The detectives knew that this document would be the final chapter of a story that had been written in tragedy and silence. They approached the task with a sense of reverent, clinical precision, ensuring that every detail was accounted for, every contradiction resolved, and every piece of evidence linked in an unbreakable chain of logic. They weren't just writing a report. They were writing a memorial, a final testament to the girl who had dreamed of archives and books and had, in the end, become the very thing she once studied, a piece of history, a record that had finally been placed on the shelf, where it belonged, preserved, remembered, and, at long last, understood. The conclusion of the Thorne case left a mark on the department that would not soon fade. The detectives, having navigated the intricate, often dark corridors of the past, emerged changed. They had seen the way a single act of violence could ripple through time, affecting lives they would never meet and creating a legacy of sorrow that spanned generations. They had seen the way justice, though often delayed and sometimes painfully insufficient, was a fundamental necessity, a way of grounding ourselves in the reality of our shared humanity. The Thorne case was not an end but a continuation, a reminder that every file on their desk was a life, a potential story, a piece of truth waiting for its moment to be told. And as they finally signed off on the last page of the Thorne report, they didn't look at it as a victory, but as a solemn acknowledgement of a task that had been finished, a debt that had been paid, and a ghost that had finally been given permission to rest. The finality of the Thorne case investigation shifted the atmosphere within the Manhattan precinct from one of academic curiosity to a solemn, almost ritualistic processing of a long-festering wound. With the corroborating evidence secured, that fragile, ink-stained receipt from a forgotten coat pocket, the task force moved to the final stage of their operation, the synthesis of the Watcher's confession into a coherent legal narrative. The letter had provided the what and the why, but the police now had the how. They began to reconstruct the internal geography of the killer's mind, mapping his movements on that humid July night in 1979 with a terrifying, step-by-step clarity. They imagined him walking the very same streets that were now filled with the hum of modern traffic, his path illuminated by the same streetlights that looked down on a completely different world. It was a haunting exercise in temporal empathy, trying to view the Lower East Side not through the lens of modern gentrification, but through the fractured, predatory eyes of a man who saw potential victims in every darkened doorway. The detectives discovered that the killer, whom they identified through the estate records as a man named Arthur Vance, had maintained an almost obsessive documentation of his own moral decline. Alongside the Journals of Shadows, they found a small, leather-bound notebook that contained lists of local residents, their routines, the times they left for work, the brands of milk they bought, and the locks they used on their doors. Clara Thorne was on that list, her routine circled in red ink, a marking that had remained there for decades. It was a chilling revelation. The murder was not an outburst of violence, but the final, inevitable conclusion of a long-term project. Vance had treated the neighborhood as his private hunting ground, a place where he was the hidden architect of reality, observing his neighbors with a cold, detached curiosity that was entirely devoid of empathy. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a simple criminal, they were dealing with a sociopathic collector of human experiences. As the team synthesized these findings, they were confronted with the complicated, messy business of telling the surviving family members. There was no easy way to deliver the news that their loved one had been the target of such calculated, long-term predation. The meetings were held in the hushed, neutral territory of the precinct's community rooms. The detectives watched as the faces of those who had mourned Clara for nearly 50 years transformed, from the weary, resigned look of long-term grief to a sudden, sharp, and terrifying clarity. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a jagged, uncomfortable truth that was far worse than the mystery of her disappearance. For decades, they had wondered why she was taken, if she had suffered, and who had decided her fate. Now they had the answers, and the answers were a weight that would shift the landscape of their lives permanently. The investigation also unearthed a deeply disturbing question about the nature of community silence. How had Arthur Vance lived in that tenement building for 3 decades, interacting with dozens of people, while harboring the secret of a life stolen just a few doors away? The detectives conducted a series of follow-up interviews with the neighbors who had lived on that floor during the 80s and 90s. The responses were universally, hauntingly similar. He was quiet. He was helpful. He never caused any trouble. It was the classic, terrifying profile of a predator who understood that the best way to hide in plain sight was to be the most boring, predictable person in the room. Vance had weaponized normalcy, using the camouflage of a polite neighbor to render himself invisible. This revelation sparked a new wave of fear in the neighborhood. Residents started to wonder who else might be living among them, wearing the mask of a mundane existence while concealing a dark, violent history. The technical analysis of the deathbed letter itself became a point of contention within the department's forensic wing. Experts in psycholinguistics were brought in to analyze the cadence of the confession. They found that the author, Vance, had written the letter not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a final attempt to assert control. By documenting the murder with such chilling detail, he was essentially framing it as his magnum opus, a piece of art that he was finally unveiling to the world before he vanished into the void. It was an act of extreme narcissism, a final, perverse demand to be remembered, even if only as a monster. The detectives were disgusted by the discovery, but they were also captivated by the insight it provided. It transformed Vance from a faceless shadow into a complex, profoundly broken individual whose identity had been tied to an act of destruction. Meanwhile, the administrative burden of the case grew as they attempted to coordinate with the district attorney's office for the final closing report. The legal system is designed for the living, not for the dead, and the process of clearing a case where the primary suspect is deceased proved to be a bureaucratic nightmare. They had to navigate a labyrinth of evidentiary standards, ensuring that every detail in the report could withstand the scrutiny of a future challenge. They were building a record that would essentially become the definitive history of the Thorne case, a document that would sit in the archives for 100 years. They felt a sense of immense responsibility, not just to the law, but to the memory of Clara Thorne, whose story was finally being recorded with the precision and the gravity it had always deserved. As they finalized the last of the investigative reports, the detectives were also forced to address the issue of the Watcher's journals. They were filled with hundreds of pages of observations about the city in the late 70s. The grime, the decay, the way the light reflected off the East River at dusk. The detectives debated whether these journals should be archived as criminal evidence or destroyed. They eventually decided that to destroy them would be to erase a part of the city's history, however dark and distorted that history might be. The journals were placed in a secure, climate-controlled vault, labeled as both historical records and criminal artifacts. They serve as a grim, unsettling testament to a time when New York City was a different place, a city that was struggling to survive, and a city where a man could move through the shadows, largely unnoticed and entirely unencumbered by the rules of society. The conclusion of the investigative work was marked by a quiet, subdued ceremony in the precinct's main office. There were no champagne toasts, no celebratory speeches. The lead detective placed the heavy, overflowing Thorne file into a specialized archival box and sealed it with a formal, metallic fastener. The click of the seal echoing in the quiet office felt like the closing of a chapter that had been written over 4 decades. The detective stood in silence for a moment, acknowledging the end of a long, emotionally draining journey. They had successfully navigated the darkness, followed the thread to its end, and brought the truth back to the surface. It was a victory, but it was a victory defined by the stark, inescapable reality of what had been lost. As the case finally transitioned from active investigation to historical record, the city outside the precinct continued its relentless, unstoppable pace. The residents of the Lower East Side walked past the buildings where Arthur Vance had once lived and where Clara Thorne had once dreamed, entirely unaware of the history that had been unearthed beneath their feet. The detectives returned to their lives, but they were not the same people they were when they first opened the Thorne file. They had been touched by the dark, and they had been changed by the realization of how close the past is to the present. The Thorne case had become a part of their own personal history, a permanent, indelible scar that served as a reminder of the fragility of truth and the persistent, clawing nature of the past. The final word of the Thorne case is not a sound, but a silence that finally, after 46 years, feels like a release rather than a shroud. The case file is now part of the permanent collection of the NYPD archives, a piece of New York's dark history that can no longer be ignored or forgotten. Clara Thorne is no longer a name on an unsolved file. She is a memory, a story told in the quiet corners of a city that never stops to listen, but that has, at long last, been forced to pay attention. And as the city lights shimmer over the East River, casting long, wavering reflections into the dark water, we are reminded that in New York, even the deepest, darkest secrets have a way of eventually finding their way home, waiting for the moment when the truth is finally, irrevocably, brought into the light. The dust that had settled over the Thorne investigation for nearly half a century didn't just coat the paper files. It seemed to settle into the very marrow of the precinct's culture. When the final administrative steps to archive the case were taken, the shift was profound. The detectives, those who had lived, breathed, and obsessively traced the ghost of Arthur Vance, found themselves in a state of suspended reality. The case was closed, yes, but the haunting realization remained that justice had been a race against biology, a race the law had narrowly won only because the killer had chosen to pull the curtain back on himself. As the file was moved to the permanent archival basement of the NYPD, the air in the precinct felt lighter, yet strangely thin. The absence of the Thorne case left a void that was not easily filled, an absence that prompted a retrospective analysis of how the department and the city itself had changed in the decades since the summer of 1979. In the weeks following the formal closure, the detectives who had led the charge, men and women who had become surrogate investigators for Clara Thorne's memory, began the process of decompressing from what had become an all-consuming obsession. They spent their evenings in the quiet corners of local bars or sitting in the parks of the Lower East Side, looking at the city with fresh, wary eyes. They began to notice the ways in which the city's history was constantly being papered over. They saw the construction of new high-rises where the old tenements once stood, and they wondered if the souls of the people who had lived there, both the victims and the predators, simply dissolved into the foundations, becoming part of the invisible structure of New York. The investigation hadn't just been a search for a name. It had been a search for the truth of a neighborhood that had almost entirely disappeared from the face of the earth. The surviving family members of Clara Thorne, who had been the focal point of the detectives' emotional labor, began their own, entirely separate process of healing. For them, the confession didn't wash away the decades of sorrow. It simply provided a new context for it. They found themselves dealing with a complex grief that was rooted in the knowledge that their loved one had been studied, stalked, and ultimately sacrificed by a man who had lived his life within walking distance of them. They held small, private gatherings, no longer focused on the mystery of her disappearance, but on the celebration of the life that had been stolen. They looked at old photographs, faded Polaroids of Clara laughing at a birthday party, or standing in front of the New York Public Library, and they finally allowed themselves to mourn the person she was, rather than the mystery she had become. The confession allowed them to stop asking what happened, and finally start asking who was she. Meanwhile, the administrative fallout of the Thorne case continued to manifest in unexpected ways. The NYPD, facing scrutiny over how such a prolific predator could have operated in the neighborhood for 3 decades without detection, began a sweeping internal review of its historical cold case protocols. The Thorne investigation became the benchmark for what the department called proactive archival integrity. The realization that a physical receipt in an attic could break a case that forensics had failed to solve forced a shift in investigative strategy. Detectives were now encouraged to look for the analog narrative, the paper trail, the old receipts, the personal letters, as much as they were encouraged to look for DNA. The Thorne case became a textbook example of how a singular, overlooked piece of context could unravel a lifetime of carefully constructed normalcy. The public reaction to the Thorne case closure was a fascinating study in the psychology of New York City. For a moment, the city stopped its relentless march toward the future and looked backward. The media stories, which had initially been sensational and aggressive, shifted toward a more reflective, somber tone. Articles appeared in major publications about the Lost Girls of 1979, examining the systemic failures that had allowed predators like Arthur Vance to move through the city with impunity. It sparked a broader, more uncomfortable conversation about the nature of urban anonymity, how, in a city of millions, one could be completely invisible, both as a victim and as a perpetrator. The Thorne case became a mirror, reflecting the city's deep, hidden fears about the disconnect between the lives we live and the lives we hide. As autumn set in, turning the leaves in Central Park into shades of amber and bronze, the detectives of the Cold Case Unit began to notice a shift in the nature of the tips they were receiving. The resolution of the Thorne case seemed to have unlocked a dam of suppressed secrets. People started calling in with information about cases that had been dormant for decades, emboldened by the Thorne success. It was as if the city had collectively decided that the era of silence was over. The detectives were inundated with calls about cold cases from the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s. It was an overwhelming, yet exhilarating, development. The Thorne case hadn't just solved a single mystery, it had empowered the community to reclaim their role in the pursuit of justice, creating a new, vibrant, and deeply human connection between the people of New York and the police force that served them. The internal psychological transition of the lead detectives was perhaps the most profound aspect of the entire post-closure period. They had spent months, sometimes years, mentally inhabiting the year 1979. They knew the music, the political climate, the grime of the subway, and the specific, humid tension of that summer better than they knew the reality of their own modern lives. Coming back to the present required a recalibration that was both disorienting and necessary. They found themselves feeling a strange, nostalgic attachment to the very past they had worked so hard to excavate. They had, in a sense, formed a bond with Clara Thorne, and the process of closing her file felt like a final act of saying goodbye. They had been the guardians of her truth, and now they were tasked with returning to the world of the living. The final administrative sign-off on the Thorne investigation took place in a small, windowless office deep in the bowels of the precinct. There was no fanfare, no final speeches. The lead detective took the heavy, seal-bound box of the Thorne case and, with a sense of solemn finality, placed it on the bottom shelf of the archival rack. It was a physical action that contained the weight of 46 years of unanswered questions. He stood there for a moment, his hand still resting on the cool, metallic surface of the archival box, and he thought about the girl who had wanted to be an archivist. He thought about how, in a strange, twisted turn of fate, she had ended up being the subject of the most complex, the most exhaustive, and the most enduring record in the history of the precinct. She had finally achieved her dream of becoming a part of the city's permanent record, though not in the way she had ever intended. As he walked out of the archives and back into the bustling, noisy reality of the modern precinct, the detective felt a strange sense of liberation. He had done his part. He had cleared the path for Clara Thorne to enter the history books, and he had provided the closure that her family had sought for half a century. He knew that there were other files sitting on the shelves, other boxes waiting to be opened, and other stories waiting to be told. The work of the Cold Case Unit was a never-ending cycle of tragedy and restoration, and the Thorne case was just one chapter in a much larger, much older, and much deeper story. He picked up his coffee, greeted his partner, and began the process of looking through a new pile of files. The past was behind him, but the work, the eternal, necessary work of the present, was waiting. The legacy of the Thorne case, however, would continue to exist in the quiet, unspoken spaces of the precinct. It would become a legend, a story passed down to the next generation of detectives as they learned their way around the Cold Case Unit. They would hear about the letter, the receipt in the attic, and the way a girl who dreamed of history finally became a part of it. They would look at the box on the bottom shelf, and they would understand the weight of what it represented. And they would know, as they sat down to open their own files and trace their own shadows, that no matter how deep the silence, no matter how cold the trail, and no matter how long the passage of time, the truth is always there, waiting in the dark, ready to be unearthed by someone who is willing to look long enough, hard enough, and with enough heart to finally see it. The finality of the Thorne case investigation shifted the atmosphere within the Manhattan precinct from one of academic curiosity to a solemn, almost ritualistic processing of a long-festering wound. With the corroborating evidence secured, that fragile, ink-stained receipt from a forgotten coat pocket, the task force moved to the final stage of their operation, the synthesis of the Watcher's confession into a coherent legal narrative. The letter had provided the what and the why, but the police now had the how. They began to reconstruct the internal geography of the killer's mind, mapping his movements on that humid July night in 1979 with a terrifying, step-by-step clarity. They imagined him walking the very same streets that were now filled with the hum of modern traffic, his path illuminated by the same streetlights that looked down on a completely different world. It was a haunting exercise in temporal empathy, trying to view the Lower East Side not through the lens of modern gentrification, but through the fractured, predatory eyes of a man who saw potential victims in every darkened doorway. The detectives discovered that the killer, whom they identified through the estate records as a man named Arthur Vance, had maintained an almost obsessive documentation of his own moral decline. Alongside the Journals of Shadows, they found a small, leather-bound notebook that contained lists of local residents, their routines, the times they left for work, the brands of milk they bought, and the locks they used on their doors. Clara Thorne was on that list, her routine circled in red ink, a marking that had remained there for decades. It was a chilling revelation. The murder was not an outburst of violence, but the final, inevitable conclusion of a long-term project. Vance had treated the neighborhood as his private hunting ground, a place where he was the hidden architect of reality, observing his neighbors with a cold, detached curiosity that was entirely devoid of empathy. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a simple criminal, they were dealing with a sociopathic collector of human experiences. As the team synthesized these findings, they were confronted with the complicated, messy business of telling the surviving family members. There was no easy way to deliver the news that their loved one had been the target of such calculated, long-term predation. The meetings were held in the hushed, neutral territory of the precinct's community rooms. The detectives watched as the faces of those who had mourned Clara for nearly 50 years transformed, from the weary, resigned look of long-term grief to a sudden, sharp, and terrifying clarity. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a jagged, uncomfortable truth that was far worse than the mystery of her disappearance. For decades, they had wondered why she was taken, if she had suffered, and who had decided her fate. Now they had the answers, and the answers were a weight that would shift the landscape of their lives permanently. The investigation also unearthed a deeply disturbing question about the nature of community silence. How had Arthur Vance lived in that tenement building for 3 decades, interacting with dozens of people, while harboring the secret of a life stolen just a few doors away? The detectives conducted a series of follow-up interviews with the neighbors who had lived on that floor during the 80s and 90s. The responses were universally, hauntingly similar. He was quiet. He was helpful. He never caused any trouble. It was the classic, terrifying profile of a predator who understood that the best way to hide in plain sight was to be the most boring, predictable person in the room. Vance had weaponized normalcy, using the camouflage of a polite neighbor to render himself invisible. This revelation sparked a new wave of fear in the neighborhood. Residents started to wonder who else might be living among them, wearing the mask of a mundane existence while concealing a dark, violent history. The technical analysis of the deathbed letter itself became a point of contention within the department's forensic wing. Experts in psycholinguistics were brought in to analyze the cadence of the confession. They found that the author, Vance, had written the letter not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a final attempt to assert control. By documenting the murder with such chilling detail, he was essentially framing it as his magnum opus, a piece of art that he was finally unveiling to the world before he vanished into the void. It was an act of extreme narcissism, a final, perverse demand to be remembered, even if only as a monster. The detectives were disgusted by the discovery, but they were also captivated by the insight it provided. It transformed Vance from a faceless shadow into a complex, profoundly broken individual whose identity had been tied to an act of destruction. Meanwhile, the administrative burden of the case grew as they attempted to coordinate with the district attorney's office for the final closing report. The legal system is designed for the living, not for the dead, and the process of clearing a case where the primary suspect is deceased proved to be a bureaucratic nightmare. They had to navigate a labyrinth of evidentiary standards, ensuring that every detail in the report could withstand the scrutiny of a future challenge. They were building a record that would essentially become the definitive history of the Thorne case, a document that would sit in the archives for 100 years. They felt a sense of immense responsibility, not just to the law, but to the memory of Clara Thorne, whose story was finally being recorded with the precision and the gravity it had always deserved. As they finalized the last of the investigative reports, the detectives were also forced to address the issue of the Watchers' journals. They were filled with hundreds of pages of observations about the city in the late 70s. The grime, the decay, the way the light reflected off the East River at dusk. The detectives debated whether these journals should be archived as criminal evidence or destroyed. They eventually decided that to destroy them would be to erase a part of the city's history, however dark and distorted that history might be. The journals were placed in a secure, climate-controlled vault, labeled as both historical records and criminal artifacts. They serve as a grim, unsettling testament to a time when New York City was a different place, a city that was struggling to survive, and a city where a man could move through the shadows, largely unnoticed and entirely unencumbered by the rules of society. The conclusion of the investigative work was marked by a quiet, subdued ceremony in the precinct's main office. There were no champagne toasts, no celebratory speeches. The lead detective placed the heavy, overflowing Thorne file into a specialized archival box and sealed it with a formal, metallic fastener. The click of the seal echoing in the quiet office felt like the closing of a chapter that had been written over 4 decades. The detective stood in silence for a moment, acknowledging the end of a long, emotionally draining journey. They had successfully navigated the darkness, followed the thread to its end, and brought the truth back to the surface. It was a victory, but it was a victory defined by the stark, inescapable reality of what had been lost. As the case finally transitioned from active investigation to historical record, the city outside the precinct continued its relentless, unstoppable pace. The residents of the Lower East Side walked past the buildings where Arthur Vance had once lived and where Clara Thorne had once dreamed, entirely unaware of the history that had been unearthed beneath their feet. The detectives returned to their lives, but they were not the same people they were when they first opened the Thorne file. They had been touched by the dark, and they had been changed by the realization of how close the past is to the present. The Thorne case had become a part of their own personal history, a permanent, indelible scar that served as a reminder of the fragility of truth and the persistent, clawing nature of the past. The final word of the Thorne case is not a sound, but a silence that finally, after 46 years, feels like a release rather than a shroud. The case file is now part of the permanent collection of the NYPD archives, a piece of New York's dark history that can no longer be ignored or forgotten. Clara Thorne is no longer a name on an unsolved file. She is a memory, a story told in the quiet corners of a city that never stops to listen, but that has, at long last, been forced to pay attention. And as the city lights shimmer over the East River, casting long, wavering reflections into the dark water, we are reminded that in New York, even the deepest, darkest secrets have a way of eventually finding their way home, waiting for the moment when the truth is finally, irrevocably, brought into the light. The archival silence that followed the sealing of the Thorne case was not merely a matter of bureaucratic process. It was a profound, atmospheric shift in the precinct that echoed through the halls of the NYPD. For months, the lead investigators moved with a quiet, lingering sense of disorientation. They had spent so long obsessively reconstructing the life of Clara Thorne and the predator Arthur Vance that their own lives had, in a sense, become secondary to the case. Now that the box was sealed, the receipts corroborated, and the journals safely tucked away in the climate-controlled vaults, they were forced to confront the modern world, a world of high-speed digital crime and instantaneous communication that felt strangely hollow compared to the deep, resonant darkness of 1979. They were detectives who had lived in the shadow of a 46-year-old murder, and re-emerging into the light felt like waking from a dream that was far more vivid than reality. The neighborhood, meanwhile, continued its rapid metamorphosis. The Lower East Side was becoming a place where history was increasingly invisible. The tenements that once harbored the secrets of men like Vance were being transformed into spaces of extreme, curated comfort, their rough-hewn brick facades cleaned and pointed, their windows replaced by energy-efficient glass. The detectives would sometimes drive through these streets on their way to newer, more pressing investigations, and they would look at the renovated buildings with a sense of quiet irony. They knew what was buried beneath the new floorboards. They knew that the ghosts of 1979 were still clinging to the bedrock of the city, even if the world above them had moved on to newer, louder concerns. They were the keepers of a history that the city was actively trying to forget, and the burden of that knowledge was something they would carry for the rest of their careers. This transition into history triggered a new phase for the Thorne family as well. For them, the closure of the case was not an end to the mourning, but a transition from an acute, agonizing question into a slow, rhythmic acceptance of a reality that was finally, unequivocally defined. They began to organize their own small, private memorials, returning to the places in the city that Clara had cherished, the parks, the library, the quiet riverfront, and they reclaimed these spaces, no longer as sites of trauma, but as places of connection. The confession of Vance had, in a twisted way, given them the power to redefine Clara's legacy. She was no longer a missing girl or an unsolved mystery. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, and a dreamer who had been taken in the bloom of her youth, and whose story, however tragic, had finally been finished. The broader implications for the department, too, were significant. The Thorne case became a standard, an institutional benchmark for the Proactive Archival Integrity Initiative. Every detective in the unit was trained on the methodology used to dismantle Vance's life, how the combination of old-school investigative persistence, modern forensic linguistics, and the careful curation of historical artifacts had succeeded where brute force and initial canvassing had failed. The Thorne methodology was written into the precinct's operational handbook, serving as a reminder that the past is never actually in the past. It is simply waiting for the right key to unlock the door. The precinct's culture changed. It became more patient, more archival, and more deeply aware of the long, slow, and often circuitous road that leads from the commission of a crime to the definitive, ironclad truth. As the months passed, the detectives began to find that their work on the Thorne case had fundamentally changed how they approached their modern duties. They found themselves looking at present-day cases with a sense of historical foresight, documenting everything, archiving every detail, and assuming that their reports might one day be read by someone 50 years into the future. They had developed a generational awareness of their work. They realized that their primary responsibility wasn't just to their precinct captains or the current district attorney. It was to the future, to the truth, and to the eventual, inevitable judgment of history. They had been transformed by the Thorne case from mere enforcers of the present law into guardians of the long-term truth, a shift that made them more thorough, more empathetic, and ultimately, more effective in their craft. The Journal of Arthur Vance, that artifact of a dark and twisted mind, became the subject of intense, confidential study by the department's behavioral analysts. They didn't just see it as evidence, they saw it as a blueprint of the sociopathic mindset in a pre-digital, urban environment. They mapped the way Vance had moved through the city, noting how he had used the chaos of the late 70s, the strikes, the blackout-era anxieties, the economic decay, as a shield for his predatory behavior. They used the journals to teach junior detectives about the invisible threat, the individual who doesn't necessarily commit crimes in a vacuum of malice, but who views their environment as a playground and their neighbors as objects to be observed, studied, and eventually destroyed. The journal was no longer just an artifact of a murder. It was an educational tool that would serve to protect future generations of New Yorkers. The media's obsession, meanwhile, finally began to wane, though the Thorne case remained a staple of true crime podcasts and investigative documentaries for years. The story was told and retold, each iteration adding a layer of myth to the reality of 1979. The detectives, when asked for comment, remained reserved, preferring to let the archival report stand as the definitive, final word. They understood that the media's need for drama often obscured the cold, hard, and deeply necessary labor of investigation. They knew that the real story of the Thorne case wasn't the sensational revelation of the letter. It was the 46 years of silence that had been fought against, the hours of painstaking research, and the eventual, necessary triumph of the truth over the convenient fiction of oblivion. The city's transformation into a place of luxury and light didn't feel like a betrayal of the past to the detectives. Rather, it felt like a necessary layer of history. They recognized that the city was a living, breathing entity, one that was constantly shedding its skin. They were content to be the ones who remembered what was underneath. In their private moments, walking through the modernized streets of the Lower East Side, they felt a strange, quiet sense of pride. They were the ones who had done the work. They were the ones who had ensured that Clara Thorne hadn't just disappeared into the void, but had been recovered, recognized, and returned to the narrative of New York City. That was their victory. Not a parade, not an award, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had held the line against the dark. As they approached the end of the year, the Thorne case file, now effectively closed, became a permanent fixture in the precinct's collective mythology. It was the case that changed the way they saw the city, the way they understood the nature of their work, and the way they perceived the passage of time. They knew that there were other cases like the Thorne case, thousands of them, perhaps, waiting in the dark corners of the precinct, waiting for their own moments to break through the silence. The Thorne resolution had given them a roadmap, a sense of direction, and a deep, abiding faith in the process of seeking the truth, no matter how cold the trail, no matter how heavy the dust, and no matter how impossible the circumstances might seem. The final, lingering thought that remained with the investigative team was the way that the truth, when it finally emerged, felt not like a shock, but like an inevitability. It was the truth that had been waiting there all along, hiding in the receipts, in the journals, and in the dark, quiet corners of Arthur Vance's distorted reality. It had just needed someone to listen, someone to look, and someone to care enough to pursue it to its final, bitter end. The Thorne case wasn't just a murder solved. It was a testament to the fact that truth is not a fragile thing. It is a weight, it is a constant, and it is a fundamental element of the universe. It will always, given enough time, find a way to surface, to assert itself, and to demand to be acknowledged, for as long as there is someone left in the dark, looking for the light. And as the precinct lights dimmed and the city outside the windows continued its ceaseless, indifferent movement, the Thorne case file remained there, a silent, unmoving anchor in the shifting currents of New York history, a piece of truth that was finally, irrevocably, fixed in its place for all of eternity. The legacy of the Thorne case had begun to manifest in ways that reached far beyond the confines of the precinct, influencing the very way the city engaged with its own shadowed history. As the investigation receded into the past, the detectives who had navigated its labyrinthine details found themselves becoming unintentional historians of the Lower East Side. They were frequently invited to speak at forums, local historical societies, and academic institutions, invited not just to recount the mechanics of the arrest, but to interpret what the resolution meant for the city's identity. The narrative of Clara Thorne, once a forgotten fragment of the 70s, had transformed into a cultural focal point, a story that allowed New Yorkers to grapple with the discomfort of their own history and the uneasy relationship between the polished present and the gritty, unforgiving past. The detectives began to notice that the Thorne case had become a yardstick for community safety, a benchmark against which modern crime and modern investigative success were measured. They were regularly approached by citizens who, emboldened by the Thorne success, came forward with their own long-held suspicions about cold cases from their own neighborhoods. It was a fascinating social phenomenon. The breaking of a 46-year silence had effectively denormalized the culture of silence itself. The precinct found itself processing a massive influx of anecdotal data, a collection of stories, rumors, and half-remembered events from the 70s and 80s that had previously been considered too small or too distant to warrant police attention. The Thorne Resolution had unlocked a reservoir of collective civic memory, proving that when the truth is finally acknowledged, the entire community feels a permission to speak. The process of managing this new wave of information was as demanding as the Thorne case itself. The detectives had to develop new frameworks for triaging historical data, balancing the urgency of modern investigations with the moral obligation to pursue the past. They realized that their work was no longer strictly about the application of penal code. It was about the social work of history. They were managing the trauma of a city that had been left to process its own dark secrets without official acknowledgement. They were becoming, in a very real sense, the city's unofficial archivists, curating the memories of the lost and the secrets of the departed. It was a role they had not anticipated, but one they embraced with a deep, methodical commitment, knowing that for many of these families, they were the only ones who could bridge the gap between a life lost and a story remembered. The internal evolution of the cold case unit was equally profound. The unit, once the quietest and least celebrated corner of the precinct, was now a vibrant, intellectually intense hub of cross-disciplinary collaboration. They began working alongside digital historians, sociologists, and archival experts, using the methodology they developed for the Thorne case to build a more comprehensive, accessible database of the city's unsolved historical crimes. They were creating a new kind of investigative landscape, a map of the city that included the invisible geography of forgotten tragedies. They were not just solving crimes. They were actively preserving the truth, ensuring that the history of the city was not merely written by the winners and the prosperous, but that it was informed by the records of the forgotten, the vulnerable, and the lost. As the detectives delved deeper into this institutional memory work, they began to confront the philosophical implications of their role as the curators of the city's dark past. They realized that every case file they opened was a piece of a larger tapestry, a narrative of the city's growth, its failures, its struggles, and its triumphs. The Thorne case had shown them that the stories we tell ourselves about the past are often incomplete, distorted, or purposefully silenced. Their job was to act as the editors of that history, carefully piecing together the broken fragments of truth to create a clearer, more honest portrait of the city. They were the ones who ensured that when the history of New York was written, it would be a history that acknowledged its scars as much as its successes. The impact of this work on the detectives' personal lives was equally transformative. They became more patient, more contemplative, and more profoundly attuned to the complexities of the human experience. They learned to value the small, often imperceptible details, the receipt in the coat pocket, the slight inconsistency in an alibi, the subtle nuance in a deathbed confession, knowing that these were the building blocks of reality. They saw the world not as a sequence of random events, but as a deeply layered, interconnected web of causes and effects, each act of violence leaving a resonance that could be traced across decades. They became students of the city's secret life, observing the way the past constantly bubbled to the surface, waiting for someone to finally see it. The media's relationship with the unit also changed. The initial frenzy of the Thorne Resolution had mellowed into a relationship of respect and, in some cases, collaboration. The journalists who covered the precinct began to realize that the work the cold case unit was doing was about more than just the headlines. It was about the fundamental, ongoing work of truth-telling. They began to produce long-form, thoughtful content that focused on the labor, the empathy, and the historical importance of the cold case work. They recognized that the detectives were engaged in an essential civic project, one that deserved to be documented with nuance and gravity. This partnership between the press and the police, forged in the wake of the Thorne success, became a model for how the two institutions could work together to uphold the public's interest in historical truth. As the final quarter of the year approached, the detectives took a moment to reflect on what they had built. The archive was no longer just a room full of paper. It was a living, breathing testament to the city's journey toward honesty. They had created a space where the past was treated with dignity, where the stories of the forgotten were given the weight of historical record, and where the truth, however late, however difficult, was finally given a seat at the table. They recognized that while they couldn't undo the violence of the past, they could ensure that the past was never allowed to vanish into the void. They had achieved the ultimate goal of their profession. They had ensured that the truth was documented, understood, and ultimately acknowledged. The final, lingering thought that occupied the unit was the realization of how fragile the entire structure of the truth actually was. The Thorne resolution had depended on so many variables: the decision of a dying man to speak, the preservation of a receipt in an attic, the persistence of a group of detectives who refused to let the file disappear into the void. It was a chain of unlikely events that had, in the end, held firm against the pressure of nearly half a century. They understood that the pursuit of justice is not a machine that inevitably produces a correct result. It is a precarious, human process that requires a constant, active commitment to the pursuit of truth. They knew that their work was never finished, that there were always more stories, more files, and more secrets waiting in the dark. And yet, as they stood in the archive, surrounded by the neatly filed, carefully documented records of the city's past, they felt a sense of profound, unshakable purpose. They knew that they were the ones who held the keys, the ones who bore the weight, and the ones who ensured that the history of New York would be a history that was not defined by its silence, but by the persistent, unyielding voice of the truth. The Thorne case was the foundation, the catalyst, and the definitive proof that the truth is never truly lost. It is simply waiting for someone to find it, someone to care, and someone to ensure that it is finally, irrevocably, given its due. As the city lights shimmered outside, the detectives turned their attention back to the files, the light of their resolve as steady and as enduring as the truth they served, knowing that for as long as they remained, the darkness would never be allowed to have the final word. The momentum generated by the Thorne investigation, once in localized internal success, had transformed into an institutional mandate for the NYPD. The detectives of the Cold Case Unit found that the sheer volume of historical inquiries they were receiving necessitated a complete restructuring of how the department archived its narrative past. They were no longer just processing evidence, they were actively curating the city's memory. This shift was profound. The precinct, once defined by the immediate pressures of the present, the midnight calls, the morning briefings, the constant, shifting grind of street-level crime, now contained a quiet, focused room dedicated to the archaeology of the recent past. They were applying the methodologies learned from the Thorne case, the fusion of linguistic forensic profiling, social network mapping of the 1970s and 80s, and the systematic recovery of lost physical artifacts, to a catalog of cases that had been deemed untouchable for decades. The internal psychological dynamic of the detectives underwent a similarly rigorous transformation. They had become acutely aware of the echo effect of their work, how a resolution in 2026 could retroactively alter the trauma cycles of families who had been effectively exiled from the justice process since the 70s. They began to implement a new standard of investigative trauma stewardship. They realized that simply calling a case solved was an insufficient end state for an investigation that had lasted nearly half a century. They implemented mandatory post-resolution counseling sessions for the descendants of cold case victims, recognizing that the truth, while necessary, was often a shattering experience that required its own level of supportive, long-term processing. The Thorne case had effectively moved the precinct into a new paradigm. Justice was no longer just an arrest or a forensic match. It was the beginning of a community-wide healing process that was, by its very nature, a permanent and evolving commitment. The scientific community, particularly forensic linguists and historians who had collaborated on the Thorne case, reached out to the department to formalize the Watcher's methodology. They argued that the successful resolution of such an old case wasn't a fluke of luck, but a replicable scientific process. They began holding workshops at the precinct, training not just detectives, but archival librarians and municipal record keepers in the techniques of contextual evidence recovery. They taught that every single piece of paper, every forgotten receipt, and every stray, non-digital artifact in a city's bureaucracy was a potential entry point into a truth that had been obscured by time. The Thorne case had essentially revolutionized the way the city perceived its own archives. They were no longer just storage centers for the dead past. They were dynamic, high-stakes reservoirs of justice that needed to be managed with the same forensic rigor as a murder scene itself. As the detectives delved into these other cases, they found that Arthur Vance's journals, those dark, cryptic observations on the nature of urban decay, were becoming an indispensable, if disturbing, resource. These journals provided a window into the predatory landscape of the late 20th century. By studying the journals, the investigators began to understand the specific, predatory patterns that Vance had utilized, how he had weaponized the anonymity of the subway system, the chaos of the city's infrastructure strikes, and the relative lack of electronic surveillance to move through the neighborhood as a phantom. They began to build a database of environmental vulnerability patterns, which helped them predict where other predators from that era might have operated and what kind of footprints they were likely to have left behind, even if those footprints were buried under decades of municipal change. This archival work brought the detectives into contact with an unexpected constituency, the historians of the city, those who documented the social, architectural, and cultural evolution of New York. The historians and the detectives found common ground in their shared obsession with the truth of the city's past. The historians provided context, social trends, neighborhood migration patterns, the impact of economic shifts on urban safety, which allowed the detectives to better interpret the cold, static evidence of the case files. It was an intellectual symbiosis that deepened the precinct's work, moving it beyond the binary of guilt and innocence into a more nuanced understanding of the social conditions that had allowed violence to flourish in the shadows of the 70s and 80s. They were, in effect, writing a social history of the city, one cold case at a time. The Thorne family's role in this new institutional landscape also evolved. They became active advocates, not just for the memory of Clara, but for the fundamental right of every citizen to have the truth of their lost loved ones unearthed, no matter how much time had passed. They spoke at city council hearings, arguing for the budget of the cold case unit to be protected from the constant, shifting priorities of municipal fiscal policy. They framed the cold case unit not as a luxury of the precinct, but as a fundamental, ethical obligation of the city to its own citizens. Their advocacy was instrumental in ensuring that the archival initiative was codified into law, guaranteeing that no matter which administration occupied City Hall, the records of the past would be protected, managed, and perpetually investigated. The detectives, for their part, found that their work on these old files brought them a sense of groundedness that was entirely absent in their faster-paced, modern investigations. In the modern world, the truth is often fragmented, lost in a deluge of electronic data and ephemeral social media footprints. But in the files of the Thorne era, the truth was dense, physical, and permanent. It existed in the handwritten notes, the weathered photographs, and the deliberate, manual record-keeping of a different age. The detectives discovered a strange, quiet beauty in this labor. They realized that they were the ones who were preventing the city's past from being reduced to a shallow, sanitized fiction. They were the ones who kept the jagged, uncomfortable edges of the truth from being smoothed away by the relentless march of modernity. The internal culture of the precinct reflected this. A sense of long-term mission began to define the cold case unit. They weren't just detectives in the temporary, tactical sense. They were stewards of the record. This shift had a lasting impact on how junior officers viewed their careers. The cold case unit was no longer a place for those nearing retirement to wind down. It was a highly competitive, prestigious posting where the most meticulous, the most patient, and the most historically minded officers competed for slots. The unit had become the intellectual heart of the precinct, the place where the city's long-term questions were addressed and where the department's ultimate, final commitments were honored. As the end of the year approached, the lead detective of the Thorne Task Force stood in the archival basement, surrounded by the neatly, systematically filed boxes that represented the city's unresolved secrets. He felt a profound, unshakable sense of duty. He knew that the archive was not a closed system. It was a breathing, waiting, and demanding witness. He knew that each box, each file, and each name represented a potential reclamation of the truth. He looked at the Thorne box, now sealed and secured on the shelf, and he recognized that while his work on that particular case was done, his work as a steward of the city's history was only just beginning. He understood that as long as the truth was hidden, the work of the police was incomplete, and that as long as there were voices in the dark, they would require someone in the light who was willing to listen, willing to search, and willing to ensure that the truth, at long last and at all costs, would be given its final, irrevocable, and triumphant voice. The city, indifferent to the labors of its archivists, continued its endless, restless movement. Outside the precinct, the Lower East Side was a symphony of light and activity, a place that celebrated its future and obscured its past with the tireless energy of the present. But beneath the streets, beneath the glass and steel, and beneath the bustling commerce, the records were held firm, secured by the detectives who understood that the past is the anchor of the present. They knew that their work was not about revenge, not about the theater of the courtroom, and not about the hollow victories of the media cycle. It was about the simple, profound act of acknowledging what had happened, honoring the lives that had been interrupted, and ensuring that in a city defined by its constant change, there were some things, the core, unchangeable facts of the truth, that would be held in place forever. The archive was the city's conscience, its memory, and its final, most enduring record, and in its silence, there was a steady, immovable promise that for every story, no matter how lost, there would eventually be a detective, a file, and a moment where the silence would be broken, and the truth would finally, at long last, be made whole. The transition of the Thorne investigation from a high-stakes, operational task force into an institutional pillar of the precinct was a process that unfolded with the deliberate, heavy gravity of a city rewriting its own internal history. The detectives involved in the Thorne resolution had become something far more substantial than mere investigators. They were now the architects of a new, memory-centric methodology that would define the NYPD's relationship with its dark, sprawling past. The archive room, once a neglected corner of the basement, had been transformed into a hub of high-level forensic linguistics and archival research. The success of the Thorne case had provided the necessary moral and political capital to secure long-term funding for the Cold Case Archival Initiative, an operation dedicated not just to the prosecution of the living, but to the forensic reconstruction of the deceased's final moments. The methodology, now colloquially referred to as the Thorne Standard, demanded that no piece of historical documentation be treated as junk data. The detectives spent their days in a state of hyper-focused analytical rigor, cross-referencing deathbed confessions with city council records, labor union strike logs, and even amateur photography collections from the late 70s. They were building an interconnected digital map of New York City that spanned decades, a system that allowed them to overlay modern biometric data with the fragmented, physical records of the analog age. It was a project of immense, almost religious dedication. They were treating the city's municipal history as a singular, unbroken crime scene, believing that if they could only see the connections clearly enough, the veil of time would finally be pulled back from all the city's unresolved tragedies. This institutional shift had a palpable effect on the precinct's daily morale. The detectives were no longer working under the crushing anxiety of an unsolved file. They were working with the steady, patient confidence of archivists who knew they were eventually going to find the answers. This sense of inevitability permeated their meetings, their briefings, and their interactions with the families of the long-lost. They were no longer promising miracles. They were promising process. They were promising that the truth was an objective, fixed entity that simply required the application of enough systematic, relentless, and historically grounded effort to bring to the surface. It was a shift that fundamentally changed the relationship between the NYPD and the community. It replaced the cold, detached silence of the past with a new, transparent, and intensely collaborative model of justice. The emotional labor of this work, however, remained as intense as ever. The detectives found themselves acting as the temporary custodians of decades of suppressed trauma. They were the ones who received the phone calls from families who had been waiting for 40 years to know what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. They were the ones who held the hands of the elderly as they processed the reality of a resolution that had come a lifetime too late. The Thorne case had taught them that the resolution of a murder was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of a lifetime of memory care. They became adept at navigating the jagged, uneven landscape of grief, learning to offer closure without promising that the past would ever truly lose its ability to hurt. The collaboration with historical societies also continued to flourish, adding a unique, scholarly dimension to the precinct's work. The detectives and the historians worked in tandem to categorize the urban decay archetypes, specific, repeatable social and structural conditions that had, in the 70s, created the perfect environment for predators like Arthur Vance to operate. They documented the way that the city's infrastructure, the subway tunnels, the abandoned tenements, the sprawling, unregulated industrial zones, had served as the hidden, shadow architecture of the era's violence. By creating this map of historical vulnerability, they were not just solving old crimes. They were creating a sociological record that could help urban planners and public safety officials understand how to design cities that were less hospitable to the kind of darkness that had allowed Clara Thorne's life to be taken so easily. The Thorne journals, those artifacts of Arthur Vance's distorted reality, remained the centerpiece of the unit's behavioral library. The behavioral analysts who spent their lives studying these pages had come to see them not as diaries, but as a map of the sociopathic landscape. They were fascinated by the way Vance had used the city's own rhythms against it, transforming the chaos of late 20th century New York into a private theater of control. These journals were now being utilized to train a new generation of investigators in the art of reading the subtext of a scene. They taught that a predator doesn't just leave fingerprints, they leave a psychological signature, a way of interacting with their environment that is as unique, as persistent, and as identifiable as DNA. The Thorne journals were the most intimate evidence they had ever possessed, and they used them with irreverent, clinical care to sharpen the department's collective intelligence. As the detectives worked, they found their sense of time becoming fluid. They lived simultaneously in the 1979 of their files and the 2026 of their daily lives. They were experts in the pop culture, the political tension, and the tactile reality of two different worlds, a cognitive dissonance that made them feel like temporal explorers. They were comfortable moving through the archival records of the late 70s, navigating the nuances of the era's language, fashion, and social mores, while simultaneously using the most cutting-edge forensic AI to parse the data of their own time. It was a unique, hybrid skill set, a combination of the historical sensibility of an academic and the tactical precision of an elite investigator that set the cold case unit apart from every other department in the city. The precinct's archival basement, once a place that was avoided and whispered about, had become a center of professional pride. It was now organized, climate-controlled, and accessible to researchers, historians, and forensic experts. The Thorne file, kept in a specialized, transparent front archival safe, served as a beacon, a symbol of the fact that no case is truly dead and that no secret is truly permanent. Every time a new detective was assigned to the unit, they were taken down to the basement, shown the Thorne file, and told the story of the receipt, the letter, and the 46-year trail that had eventually led to the truth. It was a foundational initiation, a way of grounding the new recruits in the core ethos of their mission: patience, persistence, and an absolute, non-negotiable dedication to the truth. As the long, slow work continued, the detectives found themselves developing a strange, almost familial bond with the forgotten. They felt a deep, personal loyalty to the names on their files, a commitment that went beyond the requirements of their jobs. They were the ones who ensured that these names were not just metadata in a computer system, but individuals whose stories were being told with clarity, dignity, and the respect that they had been denied for so long. The Thorne case had taught them that their work was an act of historical restitution, a way of saying to the victims of the past, "We haven't forgotten you. We have listened to your story, and we have brought you home." The city of New York, indifferent and ever-changing, continued its march through the decades, a place that thrived on the velocity of the new and the active erasure of the old. But deep inside the precinct, protected by the men and women who had committed their lives to the archival truth, the records were held steady. The Thorne file, the journals of Vance, and the thousands of other stories waiting for their moment were kept safe, waiting for the right moment, the right detective, and the right piece of evidence to break the silence. The detectives knew that their work was the final, strongest barrier against the tide of oblivion. They were the ones who held the line, who guarded the light, and who ensured that no matter how much time passed, the truth of the city's past would remain, steadfast and unyielding, ready to speak to anyone who possessed the courage, the heart, and the patience to listen to the dark, and in doing so, finally bring it into the light. The institutionalization of the Thorn cases methodology had become the hallmark of the NYPD's mid-2020s investigative philosophy, a legacy that transcended the simple closure of an individual murder. As the precinct moved further away from the date of the final resolution, the cold case unit evolved into a hub of intellectual and historical rigor that far exceeded the parameters of standard police work. The basement archives, once a place of forgotten, water-damaged boxes, had been transformed into the city's most sophisticated forensic history facility, a place where the jagged, often contradictory records of the past were synthesized into a cohesive, unassailable portrait of truth. The detectives who manned this facility were no longer just officers. They were the curators of New York's shadow history, treating the cold cases of the late 20th century with the reverence one might accord to ancient, sacred artifacts. The impact on the precinct's daily operational rhythm was transformative. The Thorn Standard, the rigorous, multi-layered approach to corroborating historical narratives, was now being applied to the city's entire catalog of unsolved crimes. This had a profound effect on the department's relationship with the public, particularly with families who had spent decades feeling that their loved ones had been written off by a system that prioritized the present over the past. The unit began holding quarterly memory forums, events where the families of cold case victims were invited to speak directly with the archival detectives, sharing personal histories, anecdotes, and forgotten leads that had never made it into the original police reports. These forums became a form of institutional penance, a way for the city to acknowledge the decades of silence and to show that the archive was not a tomb, but a place where the truth was actively being sought and honored. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, tasked with the ongoing study of the Thorn-era archives, made several groundbreaking discoveries about the predatory migration of violent offenders within the city's complex infrastructure. By mapping the movements of individuals like Arthur Vance alongside the city's historical transit data, the subway expansions, the bus route shifts, and the industrial zone closures of the late 70s, they discovered that the city's physical growth had actively facilitated the invisibility of its most dangerous residents. They published a scholarly monograph, The Geography of Invisibility, which argued that the city's rapid, chaotic expansion during the 70s and 80s had created voids, pockets of social and structural alienation where predators could operate with absolute impunity. This research became a foundational text for urban planners and public safety experts, arguing that the architecture of a city has a direct impact on the prevalence and detectability of crime. The detectives also found themselves dealing with the psychological fallout of truth delivery on an even wider scale. When they finally identified the perpetrators in other historical cases, using the same linguistic and forensic protocols that had unmasked Vance, they had to navigate the deep, complex emotional terrain of families who were suddenly confronted with the identities of their own relatives as long-forgotten murderers. The precinct developed a specific, highly refined protocol for this work, involving licensed trauma psychologists and mediators who were present during the notification process. The detectives had learned that truth was a substance that had to be administered with the precision of a doctor, ensuring that the revelation of the past didn't just shatter the present, but provided the necessary closure to allow the family to survive the revelation. As the detectives worked through the thousands of remaining files, they began to see the city as a living, multi-layered organism. They recognized that the current city of 2026, with its glass skyscrapers and high-speed digital economy, was built on top of the trauma, the secrets, and the unresolved conflicts of the past. The work of the Cold Case Unit was to bridge the gap between these worlds, to ensure that the city of the present was not just moving forward, but was, in some fundamental way, making amends with the city that had once been. They found a profound sense of purpose in this, a feeling that they were the essential link in the chain of the city's humanity, preserving the continuity of history while ensuring that the darkness was never allowed to completely swallow the light. The archival safe that housed the Thorn file, now a permanent, glass-fronted fixture in the main hallway of the cold case unit, became a silent mentor to every officer who passed it. It was a tangible, physical representation of the work's importance. Every time a new detective joined the team, they were asked to study the Thorne Report, not just for the investigative techniques it demonstrated, but for the profound lesson in institutional patience it represented. It was a reminder that the work of the police was not always characterized by the immediate adrenaline of a high-speed chase or the tactical precision of a raid. Sometimes, it was characterized by the silent, steady, and unglamorous persistence of the archive, a commitment that transcended the individual life of the officer and became a permanent, structural part of the city's safety. The detectives also began to forge a deeper, more intellectual relationship with the city's professional historians. They recognized that the detectives and the historians were essentially performing the same task from different directions. The detectives were uncovering the truth of the city's dark corners, and the historians were documenting the social and structural forces that had created them. They started a series of interinstitutional seminars discussing the evolution of urban violence, the history of social alienation, and the role of the archive in the preservation of the public conscience. This collaboration, born out of the Thorne case, was a revolution in the way the city engaged with its own past, moving from a culture of denial and erasure to a culture of forensic, historical, and deeply human accountability. As the years passed, the detectives of the cold case unit found themselves becoming the city's unofficial oral historians. They were the ones who knew the stories of the families, the legacies of the victims, and the hidden histories of the neighborhoods that were being rapidly gentrified. They were the bridge between the old New York and the new, a repository of the stories that were otherwise being paved over. They took this role with an immense, quiet gravity. They knew that their work was not just about the law. It was about the preservation of the individual identity within the vast, cold expanse of the urban environment. They were the ones who ensured that Clara Thorne and all the others like her were not just names on a file, but lives that had been lived, and that their stories were, in the end, the most important records in the city's vast, sprawling history. The final, lingering thought of the unit as they reflected on the decade that had passed since the Thorne resolution was one of profound, unwavering clarity. They knew that their work was the final, strongest barrier against the tide of oblivion. They were the ones who held the line, who guarded the light, and who ensured that no matter how much time passed, the truth of the city's past would remain, steadfast and unyielding, ready to speak to anyone who possessed the courage, the heart, and the patience to listen to the dark, and in doing so, finally bring it into the light. The precinct was a place of ghosts, yes, but it was also a place where the ghosts were finally given their due, where the silence was finally, definitively broken, and where the truth of the past was finally, irrevocably, given its place in the permanent, shining light of history. And as the city lights shimmered over the East River, reflecting the boundless complexity and the endless capacity for both light and dark that define the city, the detectives knew that their vigil was not coming to an end. They were part of a continuum, a chain of memory that stretched back into the grime of the 70s and forward into the infinite complexity of the future. They would remain at their posts, in the basement, in the archives, and in the quiet, focused study of the truth, knowing that as long as they remained, the darkness would never be allowed to have the final word. The Thorne case had been the catalyst, but the mission of remembering, of honoring, and of acknowledging the absolute, unwavering dignity of the truth, was the work that would define them for as long as they stood in the guard of the archives, ensuring that for every secret, for every lost voice, and for every silent tragedy, there would finally, at long last, be a name, a record, and a place in the light. The finality of the Thorne resolution had long since ceased to be just a departmental triumph. It had become an existential anchor for the precinct. As the mid-2020s gave way to a new era of municipal operations, the basement archives of the NYPD had evolved from a forgotten storage space into the city's primary center for historical forensic research. The lead investigators, now considered the elders of the cold case unit, watched as a new generation of detectives treated the Thorne file with the solemn reverence once reserved for departmental legends. The Watcher's deathbed confession and the meticulous corroboration that followed were no longer just a case history. They were the foundational pedagogy for every officer who stepped into the cold case unit, a primer on the absolute necessity of institutional patience and the enduring power of physical evidence in a world increasingly dominated by ephemeral digital noise. The detectives of 2026 found themselves operating in a precinct that was significantly more self-aware than it had been in the era of Clara Thorne. They understood that their work was not simply an exercise in law enforcement. It was a corrective act of historical justice. Every time they opened a new box from the late 20th century, they were aware that they were not just chasing a criminal. They were peeling back the layers of a city that had spent decades trying to sanitize its own violent origins. The Thorne case had served as the definitive proof of concept for this work. It had demonstrated that even the most deeply buried secrets, when met with the relentless, unyielding pressure of modern forensic inquiry and a refusal to accept the finality of unsolved, would eventually crack. This newfound institutional confidence was mirrored by a quiet but radical shift in the city's urban development policies. The research conducted on Arthur Vance's predatory migration patterns had directly influenced the way the city approached the construction of new social infrastructure. Urban planners, working in tandem with the precinct's behavioral analysis unit, had begun to incorporate surveillance-friendly, community-integrated architecture into the redevelopment of older neighborhoods, ensuring that the voids, those pockets of structural alienation that Vance had exploited, were designed out of the city's future. The city had realized, through the lens of the Thorne case, that the design of the environment was a critical component of public safety and that they had an ethical obligation to ensure that the mistakes of the 1970s and 80s were not being physically replicated in the glass and steel canyons of the new millennium. The emotional labor of the cold case unit had also stabilized into a sustainable, long-term practice. The precinct had institutionalized the trauma-informed support protocols developed in the aftermath of the Thorne resolution, ensuring that the delivery of truth to families was no longer a chaotic, damaging event, but a carefully facilitated, respectful, and restorative process. The detectives had learned that they were the primary facilitators of an essential civic transition, moving families from the limbo of missing or unsolved into the definitive, painful, but ultimately necessary realm of understood. They had become the guardians of a delicate, sacred balance between the brutal honesty of the law and the profound, enduring needs of the human heart. The scholarly engagement with the Thorne archives had also reached a new level of sophistication. The university partners who had helped synthesize the journals of Arthur Vance were now actively publishing peer-reviewed research on the architecture of the predator, using the case as a definitive example of how sociopathic behavior can manifest in and adapt to the rapid evolution of an urban environment. This academic interest served to legitimize the work of the precinct, elevating it from a simple investigative unit into a center of genuine, world-class research. The precinct was now a destination for forensic psychologists, urban historians, and criminal justice scholars from around the globe, all of whom sought to understand how a single, decades-old murder case had managed to rewrite the institutional rules of urban forensic investigation. As the detectives surveyed the archive room, the climate-controlled, perfectly organized, and profoundly quiet space that held the city's secrets, they felt a sense of immense, quiet pride. They were the ones who had taken the jagged, broken, and often terrifying history of New York and given it a structure, a name, and a place in the light. They knew that their work was the final, strongest barrier against the tide of oblivion. They were the ones who held the line, who guarded the light, and who ensured that no matter how much time passed, the truth of the city's past would remain, steadfast and unyielding, ready to speak to anyone who possessed the courage, the heart, and the patience to listen to the dark, and in doing so, finally bring it into the light. The legacy of Clara Thorne, once a forgotten tragedy, had been transformed into the bedrock of a new, more transparent civic identity. Every time the city's cold case unit successfully resolved an old investigation, they included a brief, respectful acknowledgement of the Thorne precedent in their final reports, recognizing that it was her case, and the letter that had finally unmasked her killer, that had unlocked the door to the archival truth. They had ensured that Clara's life, and the tragedy of her ending, had become the catalyst for the city's long-term restorative labor. She had, in the most profound sense, become the city's conscience, the girl who refused to be forgotten and who, through the persistence of those who finally listened, had forced the city to look at its own dark history with honesty and grace. The final, lingering thought of the unit as they transitioned into the later years of the decade was one of profound, unwavering clarity. They knew that their work was the final, strongest barrier against the tide of oblivion. They were the ones who held the line, who guarded the light, and who ensured that no matter how much time passed, the truth of the city's past would remain, steadfast and unyielding, ready to speak to anyone who possessed the courage, the heart, and the patience to listen to the dark, and in doing so, finally bring it into the light. The precinct was a place of ghosts, yes, but it was also a place where the ghosts were finally given their due, where the silence was finally, definitively broken, and where the truth of the past was finally, irrevocably, given its place in the permanent, shining light of history. As the city lights shimmered over the East River, reflecting the boundless complexity and the endless capacity for both light and dark that define the city, the detectives knew that their vigil was not coming to an end. They were part of a continuum, a chain of memory that stretched back into the grime of the 70s and forward into the infinite complexity of the future. They would remain at their posts, in the basement, in the archives, and in the quiet, focused study of the truth, knowing that as long as they remained, the darkness would never be allowed to have the final word. The Thorn case had been the catalyst, but the mission of remembering, of honoring, and of acknowledging the absolute, unwavering dignity of the truth, was the work that would define them for as long as they stood in the guard of the archives, ensuring that for every secret, for every lost voice, and for every silent tragedy, there would finally, at long last, be a name, a record, and a place in the light. The archival landscape of the NYPD had reached a state of perpetual, quiet equilibrium by the late summer of 2026. The Thorn case, now firmly established as the foundational text of the department's forensic history, continued to exert a gravitational pull on every investigative procedure within the precinct. The basement archives, that once neglected, labyrinthine expanse of paper, had been fully digitized, yet the physical artifacts of the Thorn investigation were kept in a dedicated, high-security display case, a constant, tangible reminder of the necessity of the analog narrative. New recruits to the cold case unit were still initiated with a mandatory deep dive into the Thorn report, a rite of passage that demanded they understand how a singular, overlooked receipt in an attic and a single, ink-stained letter had managed to topple a 46-year-old silence. The case was no longer just a history, it was a living, breathing component of the department's operational soul. Within the maximum security correctional facility where Arthur Vance's final days were unfolding, the man who had authored the Watcher's letter had become an entirely vestigial entity. His interactions with the outside world were non-existent, and his internal reality had effectively collapsed into a repetitive, sterile loop of institutional existence. The prison administration, observing the rapid, terminal decline of his health, noted that he had ceased to speak entirely. The sociopathic narrator who had once crafted a complex, chilling, and perversely poetic confession was gone, replaced by an aging man who seemed to be waiting for the inevitable arrival of a void he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. His story, once a source of terror for the neighborhood of the Lower East Side, was now just a file number, a data point that had been fully integrated into the historical record, its power to disrupt, deceive, or destroy effectively nullified by the absolute, unyielding light of the truth. As the city of New York continued its relentless evolution, the impact of the Thorn case's methodology began to yield dividends in the most unexpected sectors. The Identity Restoration Initiative, funded by the liquidation of Vance's seized estate, had successfully branched out beyond the identification of the deceased. It now maintained a state-of-the-art laboratory dedicated to the recovery of lost context, a project that used high-resolution environmental scanning to analyze historical crime scenes, searching for environmental signatures that could link cold case victims to previously unknown social circles. This research had led to the formal clearance of a series of cold cases from the mid-80s that had been plagued by erroneous assumptions. The foundation was no longer just solving murders, It was actively rewriting the historical record of the city's criminal past, one forensic breakthrough at a time. Legislative advocacy for the Sarah Vance Modernization Act, which had mirrored the Thorne archival reforms, reached a triumphant conclusion in the state Senate in early 2026. The bill, which mandated the permanent, digitized, and federally synchronized maintenance of all vital statistics archives, had become the gold standard for municipal governance. The Thorne case was the primary, cited justification for this radical overhaul, proving to the skeptical that the cost of archival preservation was far lower than the cost of allowing a cold case to fester for decades. The law, now in full effect, meant that the era of the invisible predator, the kind of individual who could exploit the cracks between state registries to build a new life on a foundation of stolen information, was effectively over. The city had built a digital firewall that was the structural equivalent of the precinct's forensic archive, ensuring that the past could no longer be used as a cloak for the present. For the surviving family of Clara Thorne, the passage of years had smoothed the sharp, jagged edges of their trauma, replacing it with a quiet, persistent sense of peace. The memorial garden had grown into a vibrant, lush ecosystem, a place that local residents visited not just for the memory of the young girl who had been lost, but for the quiet, contemplative atmosphere of the site itself. The family, now integrated into the leadership of the Thorne Foundation, spent their time ensuring that other families of the missing received the support that they had been denied for so long. They were the architects of a new kind of community empathy, one that recognized that the loss of a loved one was a permanent, transformative event, and that the only true path to survival was the collective commitment to the truth. Thomas Miller, the retired detective whose career had been bookended by the mystery of Clara Thorne, found himself in a state of profound, intellectual and emotional fulfillment. In the quiet solitude of his home, he continued to write his memoirs, not just about the Thorne case, but about the very nature of detective work, the role of memory, and the often elusive nature of justice. His work was becoming a definitive guide for the next generation, a repository of the wisdom he had acquired through decades of navigating the city's dark history. He no longer looked at the past with the haunting, unresolved intensity of his early career. Instead, he looked at it with the steady, calm gaze of a man who had completed his mission and had, in the process, helped to build a foundation upon which others could now stand. The young patrol officer who had made the final stop on the rain-slicked highway, the man whose sharp, disciplined intuition had effectively ended Arthur Vance's multi-decade run, had evolved into a seasoned, highly respected detective in the cold case unit. He had become the lead instructor for the precinct's Vance protocols, teaching the young, eager recruits that the essence of justice is not found in the dramatic, movie-like revelations of the courtroom, but in the relentless, unglamorous, and often invisible labor of the archive. He was the standard-bearer for the unit's ethos, that every case, no matter how old, no matter how cold, and no matter how impossible it seemed, was a living obligation, a responsibility to the victim, to the family, and to the fundamental, absolute truth. As the decade drew to a close, the investigative unit of the NYPD looked back at the Thorne case not as an isolated achievement, but as the catalyst for an entire, new era of historical accountability. They saw that the resolution of Clara Thorne's murder had effectively rewired the city's relationship with its own dark history. They were no longer a city that sought to move forward by burying its past. They were a city that sought to build its future by acknowledging every single one of its secrets, every single one of its tragedies, and every single one of its lost souls. The Thorne file, kept securely in its safe, was the beating, unchangeable heart of this mission, a testament to the fact that the darkness, no matter how thick, can never permanently withstand the pressure of a truth that is actively, systematically, and relentlessly pursued. The final, lingering thought of the unit as they reflected on their work was a simple, profound awareness of the continuity of their mission. They knew that their work was the final, strongest barrier against the tide of oblivion. They were the ones who held the line, who guarded the light, and who ensured that no matter how much time passed, the truth of the city's past would remain, steadfast and unyielding, ready to speak to anyone who possessed the courage, the heart, and the patience to listen to the dark and in doing so, finally bring it into the light. The precinct was a place of ghosts, yes, but it was also a place where the ghosts were finally given their due, where the silence was finally, definitively broken, and where the truth of the past was finally, irrevocably, given its place in the permanent, shining light of history. And as the city lights shimmered over the East River, reflecting the boundless complexity and the endless capacity for both light and dark that define the city, the detectives knew that their vigil was not coming to an end. They were part of a continuum, a chain of memory that stretched back into the grime of the 70s and forward into the infinite complexity of the future. They would remain at their posts, in the basement, in the archives, and in the quiet, focused study of the truth, knowing that as long as they remained, the darkness would never be allowed to have the final word. The Thorne case had been the catalyst, but the mission of remembering, of honoring, and of acknowledging the absolute, unwavering dignity of the truth, was the work that would define them for as long as they stood in the guard of the archives, ensuring that for every secret, for every lost voice, and for every silent tragedy, there would finally, at long last, be a name, a record, and a place in the light. The archive room in the Manhattan precinct had become something of a secular cathedral by the late summer of 2026. The Thorne case, the definitive cornerstone of the unit's operational identity, had long since transitioned from an active investigation into a permanent, guiding philosophy. Every piece of paper, every digitized receipt, and every recorded interview associated with the 1979 disappearance of Clara Thorne was now woven into the fabric of the unit's pedagogical structure. New detectives, those who had joined the force long after the case had been resolved, were still required to spend their first week in the unit sitting at the archival desk, reading the Watcher's letter. They were tasked with analyzing not just the evidentiary value of the document, but the psychological implications of its existence, how one man's 46-year-old secret had effectively held an entire neighborhood in the grip of a cold, unresolved terror, and how that silence had finally been shattered by the simplest, most human of acts, a deathbed confession. Arthur Vance, the man who had lived in the shadows of the Lower East Side while harboring the grim reality of a life stolen, had faded into the obscurity of his prison cell, his existence no longer of any consequence to the world outside. The institutional machinery of the NYPD had fully processed his legacy, stripping it of its power to cause further damage. The forensic psychologists who had once studied him for insights into the predatory migration of violent offenders now viewed him as a closed data point, a specimen of a specific, pre-digital archetype of urban sociopathy. His story, once a source of deep, communal anxiety, had been reduced to a case study in how the architecture of a city, the physical and social voids of the late 20th century, could inadvertently serve as a fortress for those who wished to commit acts of violence and walk away, untraced and unpunished. The success of the Identity Restoration Initiative had, by this point, fundamentally altered the cultural perception of the NYPD's cold case unit. It was no longer viewed as a department for historical clerical work. It was seen as the most vital, proactive arm of the city's forensic infrastructure. Families of the long-lost from across the nation were now regularly traveling to New York, seeking the expertise of the foundation that had risen from the ashes of the Thorne estate. The foundation, which had matured into a highly efficient, data-driven engine of justice, was currently managing dozens of parallel investigations, each one utilizing the same rigorous, cross-disciplinary methodology that had proven so effective in unmasking Arthur Vance. The Foundation's work was the ultimate, poetic reversal. The resources of a killer were being systematically dismantled to fund the recovery of those he, and others like him, had sought to erase from history. Legislatively, the ripple effects of the Thorne precedent had transformed the state's approach to public safety and archival management. The digitized, federally synchronized vital statistics network was now operating at full capacity, providing the city with a real-time, impenetrable barrier against identity-based criminal fraud. This system was the direct, legislative child of the Thorne case, a response to the glaring systemic failures that had allowed a predatory individual to walk the streets of New York for 3 decades using the credentials of a deceased infant. The law was a living testament to the fact that Clara Thorne's death had not been in vain. it had been the catalyst for a societal awakening that resulted in a structural overhaul of how the state documented, tracked, and protected the identities of its own citizens. The emotional lives of the surviving Thorne family had also moved into a new phase of profound, steady restoration. They were no longer the victims of a cold case. They were the architects of a powerful, institutionalized mission. Their leadership within the Thorne Foundation had given them a sense of control and purpose that had been denied to them for the better part of a half-century. They had successfully navigated the transition from the acute, stabbing agony of the initial loss to a long-term, reflective commitment to the preservation of truth. The Memorial Garden, now a mature, lush, and quiet space, was a place where they could experience the dignity of peace, a peace that was deeply earned through decades of waiting, searching, and eventually witnessing the final, absolute triumph of the truth. Thomas Miller, the retired lead investigator who had remained the unit's most persistent, unwavering conscience, had finally come to terms with the legacy of his career. In his final, reflective essays, he wrote about the detective's burden, the psychological cost of living within the silence of the unsolved. He described the Thorne case not as a job completed, but as a lifelong commitment that had finally reached its necessary conclusion. He spent his final months of active, post-career life mentoring the young detectives of the unit, teaching them that the badge was a symbol of an ongoing promise, not a short-term employment contract. He left behind a body of knowledge that ensured the unit would remain the city's most resilient, intellectually rigorous, and profoundly empathetic investigative body. The young patrol officer who had made the pivotal 2026 traffic stop, the man whose sharp, professional intuition had sparked the collapse of Vance's 46-year facade, had reached the pinnacle of his own career. He was now the director of the Cold Case Unit, having transitioned from the street-level patrol to the highest level of administrative and historical investigation. He remained humble, insisting that his success was not a product of genius, but of a commitment to the fundamental principles of police work, alertness, consistency, and a profound respect for the duty to see the world as it actually is. His tenure as director was characterized by a push for even greater integration between the department and the city's historical archives, ensuring that the work of the unit would remain at the cutting edge of forensic science for decades to come. As the decade drew to a close, the investigative unit of the NYPD looked